Hi guys, and welcome to Quiet History Vault tonight. You arrived just a little too late. A thin layer of ash drifts slowly through the air, settling softly on your shoulders, light as snow, but warmer than it should be. You brush it away without thinking, only to notice how quiet everything is. No footsteps, no distant voices, not even the sound of wind. Just a stillness that feels unnatural. You take a slow breath, and there is a faint, bitter taste in the air. It lingers longer than expected. You pause, because something here does not quite make sense, and the more you notice, the clearer it becomes. If you were truly standing here, you would not have time to understand it. You probably would not survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to share your location and local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where in the world you're listening from. Now dim the lights, flow straight into the story. You stand at the edge of a medieval village in the deep middle of winter, and the first thing you notice is not the cold. It is the smell. Wood smoke hangs low over everything. Damp straw, wet wool, a faint sourness from unwashed bodies packed too closely together for too many weeks. Beneath it all sits another scent, quieter but unmistakable once you recognize it. Thin stew, mostly water, barely enough oats to cloud the surface. The village itself seems smaller than you expected. Modern movies always give medieval settlements dramatic towers and endless crowds. In reality, most villages are clusters of crooked wooden homes crouched against the weather, like nervous animals waiting for a storm to pass. Roofs sag under damp frost. Chickens scratch weakly through frozen mud. Somewhere nearby, a baby cries with the exhausted rhythm of a child who's been hungry long enough to forget surprise. You walk slowly down the narrow path. Your boots sink into half-frozen sludge mixed with straw and manure. Medieval roads are not charming little cobblestone lanes, unless you happen to be wealthy or extremely lucky. Most are mud. Endless mud. Winter merely changes the flavour. A dog watches you from beneath a cart, too tired to bark. You pull your cloak tighter, though honestly, it would not help much. Medieval winters inside northern Europe could be brutal, especially during colder centuries when harvests failed more often. People did not simply get cosy beside roaring fireplaces all season. Many homes had little insulation, tiny fires, and smoke-filled interiors that stung the eyes constantly. Imagine trying to sleep inside a campfire that occasionally leaks snow. You pass one cottage where the shutters are slightly open. Inside, you glimpse 5 people pressed together beneath rough wool blankets. Their breaths rise pale in the dim light. One old woman coughs deeply into a cloth, already stained dark from repeated use. No one wastes energy speaking, and that silence matters. A commonly accepted historical reality is that winter hunger was not usually dramatic starvation all at once. More often it arrived slowly, quietly. The food stores from autumn simply grew thinner week after week until every meal became a negotiation. One more scoop of grain now might mean no bread at all before spring. You continue toward the centre of the village where a small communal oven still radiates faint warmth. Several women stand nearby clutching baskets that feel much too light. One lifts a cloth so briefly you barely see the contents. A few dark loaves, dense as stones. Not wheat bread, of course. Wheat is expensive. Reserved for nobles' monasteries or special feast days if fortune smiles upon you for 5 entire seconds. Most ordinary people survive on rye, barley, oats, and whatever else can be stretched into flour without actively poisoning everybody. Though to be fair, sometimes poisoning still happened. You kneel beside one loaf cooling on a board. The crust is almost black. It smells earthy and bitter. A little sawdust mixed into flour was not unheard of during desperate years. Neither were crushed acorns. In especially lean winters, people across parts of Europe experimented with bark flour from trees. Yes, actual trees. Somewhere a medieval baker probably stared at a pine trunk and thought, "You know what, maybe?" You hear soft church bells somewhere beyond the fog. The villagers react immediately, heads lower, conversations stop. Faith sits everywhere here, in hunger, in weather, in fear. Most people genuinely believe winter hardship carries spiritual meaning. A failed harvest might be punishment. A harsh frost could reflect divine anger. Or perhaps demons. Medieval theology occasionally overlaps with the logic of somebody trying to explain why their cow exploded. Scholars continue to debate how deeply ordinary peasants believed every sermon they heard, but surviving records show that religion shaped daily survival in powerful ways. People prayed for mild weather, healthy animals, and full granaries with the same urgency modern people reserve for emergency bank alerts. You approach the church itself, a squat stone structure with frost gathering along the edges of its wooden door. A few villagers linger outside, exchanging tiny scraps of news. News matters intensely in winter. If another nearby village has surplus grain, maybe there is hope. If roads remain open, maybe merchants will arrive. If the river freezes too thickly, maybe nobody comes at all. One man whispers that wolves were seen near the forest line yesterday. Another claims travellers farther north are eating horse meat already. Nobody looks shocked. Inside the church, candles flicker weakly in the cold air. Their scent mixes with incense and damp wool. You sit quietly near the back while a priest speaks about endurance, about Job, about suffering with dignity. Several listeners look half asleep from exhaustion. One child openly gnaws on a piece of leather string tied around his sleeve. Not because he enjoys it, because chewing sometimes tricks the body for a few moments. You glance upward toward the ceiling beams blackened by years of smoke. Somewhere above, hidden among the rafters, small stores of grain may be tucked away secretly by desperate families. Medieval theft during winter was common enough that many peasants hid food constantly, even from neighbours. And neighbours noticed everything. You leave the church near sunset. The sky turns pale grey-blue, the colour of the old iron. Frost thickens over the fields surrounding the village. Empty fields now, bare stubble poking through frozen ground where autumn crops once stood. That is the terrifying part. You can see exactly how little remains. In summer there is movement everywhere. Planting, weeding, harvesting. Noise gives comfort. Winter strips all that away. What survives now depends entirely on decisions already made months earlier. A poor harvest cannot be fixed in January. The wind shifts suddenly across the open land, sharp enough to sting your face. A woman nearby pulls two children closer beneath her cloak as they walk home carrying a tiny sack of oats. The younger child keeps glancing toward the bag every few seconds as if staring hard enough might increase its contents. It will not. Ahead, smoke rises slowly from the village roofs into the darkening evening. Fires are being lit carefully now. Every stick matters. Every crumb matters. And beneath the growing cold, you begin to understand the true rhythm of medieval winter. People are not merely waiting for spring. They are calculating whether spring will arrive before the food disappears. Morning arrives slowly like a reluctant apology. You wake not because you are rested, but because the cold has crept through the walls and settled into your bones. The cottage around you smells of damp straw, old smoke, and sleeping bodies. Somewhere beside the hearth, embers still glow faintly beneath grey ash, carefully preserved overnight because starting a completely new fire cost effort, tinder, and luck. Medieval people treat fire the way modern people treat phone batteries at 1%. Every movement inside the cottage feels deliberate. One woman kneels beside a storage chest with the seriousness of a priest opening sacred relics. Her fingers pause before lifting the lid. Everyone watches. Even the children understand this moment matters. Inside sits the future, or at least the remaining version of it. A cloth bundle of oats, several onions gone soft around the edges, hard cheese wrapped in linen, a narrow sack of rye flour, dried peas, salt, 2 shriveled apples carefully separated from the rest, so nobody accidentally eats them too soon. You notice immediately how small the supplies look. That is because medieval households rarely possessed giant overflowing storerooms unless they belonged to nobility monasteries or wealthy merchants. Most peasant families survived season to season with little margin for error. One storm at the wrong time, one patch of crop disease, one lord demanding higher rents. Suddenly winter becomes an endurance test measured spoonful by spoonful. Outside dawn creeps over the frozen fields in pale silver light. You step into the cold air and hear the village waking around you. A cough from one cottage. An axe striking wood somewhere far off. The low irritated sound of a cow that clearly expected breakfast already. Animals eat before humans surprisingly often. That sounds strange at first until you realize a living cow means milk later. A surviving chicken means eggs in spring. A healthy ox means ploughing. Medieval families constantly calculate survival across months, not merely days. Sometimes feeding livestock preserves the household better than feeding yourself. You walk toward the fields beyond the village where remnants of autumn still cling to the earth. Frozen cabbage stalks poke through frost. Broken turnip leaves lie flattened against the mud. Everything feels paused. But winter hunger truly begins in autumn. The quality of harvest decides nearly everything now. Medieval communities depend heavily on grain production because grain stores relatively well compared to fresh foods. Rye, barley, oats and wheat become bread, porridge, ale and pottage. Without grain, the entire system wobbles dangerously. A widely recognized historical fact is that many medieval peasants consumed most of their calories through bread and grain-based dishes. Meat existed certainly, but for ordinary people it often appeared rarely, especially during difficult winters. You kneel beside a harvested field while icy wind pushes against your cloak. The soil smells cold and metallic. Nearby, several villagers move slowly through the stubble, searching for overlooked scraps left behind after harvest, gleaning tiny forgotten grains, missed vegetables, anything useful. Even children participate, their red hands scraping through frozen dirt with determined focus. One little girl triumphantly uncovers a damaged beet no larger than her palm. Her expression resembles somebody discovering treasure. Honestly, under these conditions she has. A strange little historical curiosity drifts through your mind as you watch them work. In parts of medieval Europe, people sometimes believed certain fields carried protective blessings, if harvested in particular patterns or during specific saints' days. Agriculture mixed practical labour with layers of folklore so deeply that planting itself could feel almost ceremonial. Somewhere exhausted peasants were trying to optimize both crop rotation and supernatural favour simultaneously. You continue walking until you reach the manor granary standing above the village like a guarded promise. Thick wooden walls, elevated floor, locked doors. Now this is where tension lives, because not all grain belongs to the people who grow it. Feudal systems vary across Europe and centuries, but many peasants owe rents, labour or portions of harvest to local lords. Even during lean years, obligations often remain. The manor stores grain not merely for generosity, but for economics, taxation and survival of the estate itself. You see a reeve standing outside recording figures onto wax tablets, while villagers wait nearby with sacks over their shoulders. Nobody smiles much around reeves. They represent arithmetic during a season when arithmetic becomes terrifying. One older man quietly argues that his yield was damaged by early rain. The reeve barely reacts. Rules are rules. Historians still dispute how flexible local lords truly became during severe shortages. Some records show landlords reducing demands to preserve labourers alive for future harvests. Others reveal brutal collections continuing despite starvation. Medieval life changes dramatically depending on where and when you happen to exist, which is honestly inconvenient for modern historians and deeply unfortunate for medieval peasants. The wind sharpens again. Snow threatens overhead, though only faint flakes drift down so far. You return toward the village centre where several women are cleaning dried beans beside a doorway. Their fingers move automatically despite numbness. One woman cracks a joke about beans causing more wind than the winter sky. The others laugh quietly, and there it is. Humour. People joke during famines, during wars, during terrible winters. Humans carry sarcasm into almost every disaster imaginable. Somewhere in history, somebody absolutely slipped on frozen manure and became the entertainment of the week. Near the communal well, a young boy struggles carrying water with stiff hands. You help steady the bucket briefly and feel how icy the rope has become. The water itself smells earthy and cold. Clean water is never guaranteed here, nor is nutrition. By late winter, vitamin deficiencies begin appearing quietly across many communities. Weak gums, exhaustion, greater vulnerability to disease. Medieval people may not understand vitamins scientifically, but they understand certain foods restore strength better than others. Onion, garlic, cabbage and herbs become precious not merely for flavour, but because bodies crave them desperately after months indoors. Inside, one cottage supper begins early. You sit near the hearth watching steam rise from a pot suspended over the fire. Thin pottage bubbles slowly, mostly oats, some cabbage. Tiny fragments of onion drifting across the surface like survivors after a shipwreck. Still, the smell feels comforting. Warm food matters emotionally as much as physically during winter. The simple act of holding a hot bowl between frozen hands can feel luxurious beyond description. The family eats carefully, slowly. Nobody takes large bites. One elderly grandfather tears bread into such tiny pieces you almost miss the movement. Across from him, a little boy keeps staring toward the hanging strips of smoked meat near the rafters. They remain untouched. Too valuable? Not yet. You realise suddenly that medieval hunger rarely looks dramatic at first glance. People continue sweeping floors, feeding animals, repairing tools. Life continues normally on the surface. That is what makes it unsettling. The shortage hides inside ordinary routines. One fewer spoonful tonight, one thinner loaf tomorrow, one animal sold next week, and always the same silent question hanging beneath every conversation like wood smoke in the rafters. Will the stores last long enough? Outside, darkness settles over the village once more. Snow finally begins falling properly now, soft and steady across roofs already heavy with frost. You listen to the faint crackling fire beside you, while the household drifts toward uneasy sleep. Above the cottage, beams hidden carefully beneath cloth and straw, a few remaining onions wait in darkness. Counted already. Counted again tomorrow, the pantry's quieter now. Not literally, of course. Medieval pantries creak constantly. Mice scratch behind boards. Hooks rattle softly overhead. Damp wood pops in the cold. But emotionally, something has changed since your first days in the village. The room no longer feels like storage. It feels like a countdown. You duck through the low doorway into the household storeroom just after sunrise. Frost clings to the edges of the hinges and your breath fogs instantly in the stale air. The room smells dense and complicated. Salt, mould, onion skins, sour ale, dry grain dust. A faint sweetness from apples beginning to collapse inward. One candle burns carefully in the corner. Carefully because candles are expensive too. The woman of the house kneels beside several sacks laid across the floor. She unties each one slowly, almost ceremonially. You notice she already knows the weight of every bag without lifting them. Medieval households memorize food stores the way sailors memorize coastlines. This sack is lower than last week. That cheese is sweating oddly. Those peas must stretch another month. You crouch beside a barrel holding salted herring packed tightly in brine. The smell punches straight through the cold, sharp enough to water your eyes. Preserved fish becomes vital during winter, especially in regions shaped heavily by church fasting rules. Many Christians avoid meat on certain holy days, but fish remains acceptable. Conveniently preserved fish also survives transport and storage far better than fresh meat. Although survives may be generous. One herring looks old enough to remember Charlemagne. Still edible, probably. A respected historical understanding is that food preservation determined whether medieval communities survived winter at all. Salting, smoking, drying, fermenting and pickling were not culinary hobbies. They were survival technologies. Without them, entire populations would face starvation long before spring. You watch the household inventory unfold piece by piece. A tiny wheel of cheese hardened almost like stone, garlic braided from ceiling beams, turnips buried in sand to slow rot, a crock of ale cloudy with sediment, several precious handfuls of walnuts hidden inside cloth. Everything has a purpose now. Nothing is casual. The youngest daughter reaches toward a jar of honey sitting high on a shelf. Her mother gently moves her hand away before she can touch it. No anger, just immediate reflex. Honey is medicine. Honey is trade. Honey is tomorrow. Children in medieval households learn scarcity early. Not through lectures, through glances, through portion sizes, through watching adults hesitate before every decision involving food. You step deeper into the pantry and notice small chalk marks scratched along one beam. Days, perhaps, or loaf counts, or measures of grain already consumed. People track survival physically here. No spreadsheets, no phone reminders, just memory scratches in wood and worry. A curious little tidbit from medieval Europe drifts through your thoughts as you examine the shelves. In some regions, families believe certain foods spoiled faster if watched too closely by jealous neighbours or visitors with bad eyes. Protective charms occasionally hung near milk or grain stores to guard against envy itself. When your entire winter depends on one barrel not rotting honestly, you become open-minded about magical security systems. Outside a rooster crows weakly somewhere beyond the yard. Snowmelt drips slowly from the roof despite the bitter air. The weather has shifted slightly warmer today, which sounds pleasant until you remember warmer winters often create dampness. Dampness ruins grain. Dampness spreads illness. Medieval people distrust mild winter thaws almost as much as deep freezes. The man of the household enters carrying a small sack from the loft above the stable. His boots leave wet straw across the floor. He empties the sack carefully onto the table. Beans. Not many, but enough to visibly relax everyone for a moment. That reaction tells you everything. In modern life, beans rarely inspire emotional relief unless somebody's extremely dedicated to protein intake. Here, beans mean calories. Protein, fullness, survival. Legumes become foundational winter foods precisely because they store relatively well and stretch meals effectively. You hear the grandmother whisper a quiet prayer under her breath while sorting them. Not dramatic, just thankful. One bean rolls off the table and lands near your foot. The youngest child lunges for it instantly before it disappears between the boards. Nobody laughs. You notice another change too. The meals themselves are becoming psychologically important. Not merely nourishment, but structure, routine, reassurance. Medieval winter nights are long beyond modern imagination. Without electric lights, entertainment, or reliable travel, darkness dominates daily life. Shared meals become emotional anchors holding households together against the cold, which becomes difficult once portions shrink. You follow the family into the main room where dough is being prepared near the hearth. The flour smells darker now than before, earthier, less pleasant. The woman mixes rye with barley and a small amount of oat flour to extend supplies. Her hands move automatically despite cracked skin along the knuckles. The dough feels coarse beneath her fingers. Bread changes gradually during hard winters. At first nobody notices much. Then loaves become denser, smaller, darker. Eventually ingredients appear that barely qualify as food. Accounts from difficult periods mention peas mixed into flour chestnuts ground into meal, and even grasses or roots added during severe shortages. Medieval cooking often operates on the principle of can this technically enter the body without immediate death? Historians continue discussing how widespread extreme famine foods truly became in ordinary winters versus catastrophic ones. Surviving records naturally focus on the worst events, because nobody writes dramatic chronicles titled, "This year, was moderately adequate. Still, the fear remains constant. You sit near the fire while the bread bakes slowly beside glowing embers. The smell fills the cottage, gradually warm and nutty despite the rough ingredients. Everyone breathes a little deeper once the aroma spreads. Smell alone comforts hungry people. That realization feels painfully human. Outside, the village moves quietly through another cold afternoon. Smoke rises from chimneys in thin, pale streams. Somewhere nearby, somebody chops frozen wood with rhythmic determination. A baby begins crying again. A dog answers with tired barking before giving up halfway through. The grandmother beside you starts telling stories softly while waiting for the bread. Stories matter too. Winter creates storytellers because darkness lasts forever and hunger needs distraction. Tales of saints, wolves, spirits, miracles, old harvests, foolish lords, impossible weather. Memory becomes entertainment once food grows scarce. One story claims a neighbouring village survived a terrible winter decades ago by boiling leather belts and horse harnesses. Nobody questions it. You suspect everyone secretly wonders whether leather truly tastes terrible once boiled long enough. Finally, the loaf emerges from the hearth, small, dark, perfectly divided before it even cools. The woman cuts each portion with astonishing precision. No slice larger than another. No accidental generosity. Hunger forces mathematics into every motion. You hold your own piece carefully. The crust feels hard against your fingers. Steam curls upward, carrying the smell of rye and smoke. When you bite into it, the bread tastes heavy, sour, and slightly bitter. And for one quiet moment, absolutely wonderful, because it is still bread, and the pantry, though quieter now, is not empty yet. The bread changes before anyone admits it. At first, the loaves simply become smaller. Then the crust darkens. Then the smell shifts from warm and nutty to something sharper, heavier, almost smoky even before baking. You notice it one freezing morning when a woman tears open a fresh loaf and the inside looks grey instead of brown. Nobody comments. That silence says enough. You sit near the communal oven while villagers arrive carrying dough wrapped in cloth. The air inside feels thick with heat, sweat ash, and rising yeast. It almost shocks your skin after days of icy wind outside. Children crowd near the walls just to steal warmth from the stones. One boy stares at the baking bread with the intensity of a pilgrim seeing a holy relic. Honestly, fair enough. Bread is not a side dish here. It is survival shaped into a loaf. Throughout much of medieval Europe, ordinary people depended heavily on dark breads made from rye barley oats, or mixed grains rather than fine white wheat. Wheat flour produced softer, lighter loaves, but it cost more and often remained associated with wealthier households. Peasants learned to live with bread dense enough to threaten dental stability. You watch a baker slap dough onto a wooden board. His hands move quickly despite swollen knuckles cracked from cold weather. Flour dust clings to his beard. He looks exhausted in the way medieval people often do during winter. Not dramatic exhaustion, just constant weariness settling permanently behind the eyes. The dough itself feels rough when he lets you touch it briefly. Too much brawn. Too little wheat. And perhaps something else mixed in as well. That is the uncomfortable reality of winter shortages. Bread stretches to meet hunger. Millers, bakers, and households all experiment with additions once grain supplies begin shrinking. Crushed peas, bean flour, ground oats, acorns if desperation deepens far enough. You hear someone quietly joke that next month they will be baking roof bread made entirely from straw and regret. A few people laugh harder than the joke deserves. The oven roars softly nearby. Sparks drift upward each time the baker opens the iron door. The smell should feel comforting, but instead it carries tension. Everyone here knows exactly how much flour remains in their homes. A lesser-known detail from some medieval communities involves bread rituals that seem oddly emotional today. Certain households mark loaves with protective symbols before baking, including crosses or simple patterns cut into the dough. Partly religious, partly practical, partly tradition. When bread determines whether your children survive winter, the line between cooking and prayer becomes extremely thin. Outside snow crunches beneath the boots as more villagers arrive. A woman unwraps her dough and mutters under her breath when the baker weighs it in his hands. Too light. Not enough grain. You notice how often medieval life involves weighing things. Measuring. Counting. Estimating. Every household becomes obsessed with quantity during hard winters. Modern people track calories for fitness goals. Medieval peasants track calories because February exists. The baker lowers another loaf into the oven while speaking quietly with an older man beside you. The conversation drifts toward rumours from nearby towns. Bad harvest farther south. Frozen rivers blocking trade. A monastery reportedly selling grain at high prices. Nobody sounds surprised. Food insecurity spreads easily across medieval regions because transportation moves slowly even under ideal conditions. A failed harvest in one area can ripple outward through trade routes and rising prices. Once roads become muddy or frozen, relief arrives painfully late if it arrives at all. Researchers continue examining how much local communities relied on trade versus self-sufficiency during severe winters. Some villages survived mainly through their own stores, others depended heavily on nearby markets or monastic aid. Geography quietly decides many fates long before winter begins. A child beside the oven begins crying from hunger. Not loudly, just small exhausted whimpers. His mother breaks off a corner from her own ration and presses it into his hand immediately. You notice she does not eat afterward. Nobody acknowledges that either. The baker finally hands you a fresh loaf still warm enough to sting your fingers slightly. The crust feels thick and uneven. When you tear it open, steam curls upward, carrying a sour, earthy scent. Rye, mostly rye now. Rye survives colder climates better than wheat, making it vital across northern and eastern Europe. But rye bread can become extremely dense, especially when flour quality declines. Poorly processed rye also carries risks. Ergot fungus sometimes infects rye crops, causing terrifying symptoms if consumed in large amounts. Hallucinations, convulsions, burning pain in limbs. Imagine already starving through winter and then your bread decides to become haunted. You step carefully through the snowy lane, carrying the loaf beneath your cloak. Smoke drifts from cottage roofs in lazy grey streams. Somewhere nearby, somebody is boiling cabbage. The smell hangs over the village permanently now. Inside the cottage, supper preparation begins immediately. Bread waits on the table beside a pot of thin stew. One elderly woman slices the loaf with astonishing precision. Again you notice how exact everyone becomes around food. No thick slices, no crumbs wasted. One child quickly brushes fallen crumbs from the table into his palm and eats them without hesitation. You sit near the hearth while the family shares their meal. The bread tastes sour and heavy. It sticks slightly to your teeth. Yet the warmth spreading through your body feels almost luxurious after hours outdoors. The grandfather across from you begins reminiscing softly about winters from his youth. Bigger pigs, better ale, snow deeper than rooftops, bread thicker than bricks. Old people throughout history possess an almost supernatural confidence that were used to behave properly before the current generation ruined everything. One woman rolls her eyes affectionately while stirring the stew. Then conversation turns quieter. The flour stores, how long they may last, whether another sack should be purchased now before prices rise further, whether selling a goat might become necessary. You hear hesitation before every sentence, because once winter food calculations begin failing, options disappear quickly. The youngest daughter asks whether spring planting will happen early this year. Nobody answers immediately. Instead, the grandmother reaches over and gently smooths the girl's hair back from her forehead. Firelight flickers softly across tired faces. Outside, wind rattles weak shutters against the walls. Finally, the old man speaks. If the ground softens, not hopeful, not hopeless either, just practical. And that practicality may be the most medieval thing of all. The bread grows darker, the bowls grow thinner, but tomorrow morning the oven will still be hot, and everyone will return carrying whatever flour remains. The pot never truly empties. That is the strange magic of medieval winter cooking. You wake before dawn to the sound of soft bubbling from the hearth. Not loud boiling, just a steady, quiet simmer like the cottage itself breathing slowly in the dark. The fire has been coaxed awake again from yesterday's embers, and above it hangs the great iron pot that seems older than half the village. Inside waits pottage. Always pottage. The smell reaches you before the light fully does. Onion, wet grain, cabbage softened almost beyond recognition, a faint trace of garlic lingering in the steam. It is not unpleasant. In fact, after days in the village, the scent has become oddly comforting, like hearing familiar footsteps in another room. You sit near the hearth while the woman of the house stirs the mixture with a long wooden spoon darkened from years of smoke. The contents shift heavily, thick in some places, watery in others. Every household makes pottage differently because pottage is less a recipe than a survival strategy. Whatever can boil together does. Throughout medieval Europe, pottage formed the foundation of ordinary daily meals for many people, especially peasants. Grain vegetables, herbs, legumes, bits of fat, maybe occasional meat if fortune smiled briefly upon the household. It could simmer for hours or even days with ingredients added gradually whenever something became available. The medieval equivalent of opening your refrigerator, staring into despair and saying, well, soup again. You lean closer to the fire, stretching frozen fingers toward the warmth. Smoke drifts upward through a hole in the roof, though not very efficiently. Your eyes sting slightly. The youngest child sleeps beside the wall, wrapped in wool blankets while soft orange light flicker across his face. The grandmother drops several dried peas into the pot one at a time as though releasing tiny treasures. Because she is. Nothing enters casually now. One carrot remains on the table nearby, crooked and pale after months in storage. You notice everyone glancing at it periodically, not yet added. Still valuable enough to delay. That hesitation captures winter perfectly. Not starvation exactly. Anticipation of scarcity. You take a wooden bowl once the first serving is ready. Steam rises against your face, carrying earthy warmth. The pottage tastes mild at first, then salty, from preserved drippings added earlier. Tiny oat grains cling to your tongue. The cabbage has nearly dissolved into softness. And despite everything, it fills your stomach. That matters enormously. A fascinating little historical detail emerges while you eat. In some medieval households, the cooking pot itself held almost symbolic importance, because it remained constantly active through winter. Certain communities believed allowing the hearth fire to die completely brought terrible luck or invited harmful spirits into the home. Practicality and superstition sat side by side constantly in daily life, sharing the same bowl. Outside, pale morning light spread slowly over the village. Frost coats fences and roof edges in silver-white lines. A crow lands beside the well and immediately begins pecking through frozen mud with determined irritation. You honestly respect the crow. Everybody here is improvising survival. The family eats quietly around the hearth. Wooden spoons scrape bowls in soft rhythmic sounds. One child lingers over every bite, trying to make fullness last longer psychologically, even after the food has gone. You notice the father subtly tilting more liquid than solids into his own bowl. Parents throughout history have performed this exact trick. The stew pot becomes thinner by evening, thicker after market days, sometimes enriched with scraps of bacon or bits of salted fish, sometimes almost entirely grain water. Winter cooking depends on what remains available week by week. You spend the afternoon helping gather herbs hanging from the rafters. Dried thyme, parsley, sage, tiny onions braided together. Their smells release faintly as you handle them sharp and green against the smoky air. Flavor matters more than you expect. Even tiny improvements in taste help morale during long winters. Medieval cooks understand this deeply. Mustard, garlic, vinegar, and herbs appear often not because life is luxurious, but because repetitive food slowly exhausts the spirit. An observation many historians agree upon is that medieval people often possessed a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of preserving and seasoning food given the limitations of the era. They worked constantly against spoilage monotony and nutritional weakness using every available technique. The grandmother crushes herbs between her fingers and tosses them into the pot. Instantly the room smells richer. Everyone notices. Nobody says anything for a moment. Then the oldest daughter smiles faintly. Tiny comforts become enormous in winter. You step outside later carrying a bucket toward the well. Snow crunches sharply beneath your boots. Smoke drifts low across the village, trapped beneath heavy grey clouds overhead. Several cottages release the same familiar scent now. Pottage. You realise nearly the entire village is eating versions of the same meal. Different bowls perhaps, same struggle. Near the church, two women exchange recipes in hushed voices, though recipes may not quite be the correct term. One suggests adding crushed peas earlier to thicken the broth more effectively. Another claims boiling onions separately softens bitterness in old cabbage. This is culinary science born from necessity. Nearby a man mutters that his cousin in another village supposedly made stew from nettles and ale during a terrible winter years ago. Someone else insists acorn mash tastes acceptable if soaked long enough. You strongly suspect acceptable is doing heroic work in that sentence. Researchers remain divided on how nutritious some famine foods truly were compared to the energy spent gathering and preparing them. Certain substitutes may have provided little actual benefit beyond briefly quieting hunger, but hunger itself changes priorities. Full nutritional efficiency becomes less important than immediate survival. Back inside the cottage, evening settles slowly. The fire pops softly beneath the iron pot while shadows stretch longer along the walls. One child dozes against his mother's shoulder. The old grandfather sharpens a knife beside the hearth, with slow, patient movements. Again the stew bubbles. Again bowls are filled. Again the family survives another day, and you begin noticing something else hidden inside all this repetition. Pottage is not merely food, it is time management. It stretches ingredients, keeps people near warmth, allows multitasking during endless indoor hours, provides comfort while requiring relatively little fuel compared to constant baking. Medieval cooking evolves around efficiency because winter punishes waste mercilessly. You stare into the pot while steam curls upward in twisting pale ribbons. Tomorrow the same vessel will hold slightly different ingredients. A little less grain perhaps, more water, maybe one precious carrot finally surrendered to the broth. But the fire will burn again, the spoon will stir again, and as long as something still simmers inside that blackened iron pot, the household continues believing spring may arrive before the hunger grows too large to ignore. The animals are quieter too. You notice it at dawn while walking past the byres beside the frozen lane. Usually livestock creates constant noise, rustling straw, hooves against wood, chickens complaining about existence in deeply personal terms. But winter has softened everything. The sounds now feel slower, tired. A cow shifts heavily in its stall and exhales a cloud of steam into the cold air. The smell inside the barn hits you immediately. Hay, wet wool, manure, sour milk. Animal heat trapped beneath timber beams darkened by years of smoke and breath. Oddly enough, this may be the warmest place in the village. Many medieval households kept animals close during winter, sometimes extremely close. In poorer homes, livestock might even shelter within part of the living space because animals provided warmth as well as survival. Imagine trying to sleep while a goat judges your entire lifestyle from 3 feet away. The father of the household stands near the stalls, counting quietly beneath his breath. Not the animals themselves, the feed. You see it in the way his eyes move between bundles of hay stacked against the wall. Each one represents time, days remaining before impossible choices begin. That is the hidden cruelty of winter hunger. People are not the only mouths to feed. A broadly accepted reality of medieval rural life. is that livestock represented wealth, labour, food production, and future stability all at once. Losing animals during winter could damage a household for years afterward. A dead ox meant weaker ploughing. A lost cow meant less milk. Fewer chickens meant fewer eggs once spring returned, so every feeding becomes a calculation. You help carry hay from the loft overhead. Dust drifts through pale shafts of morning light while mice scatter beneath your boots. The hay smells sweet despite the cold, though not nearly sweet enough to calm the tension hanging through the barn. There is less of it than there should be. Always that same realization, less than hoped. The grandmother feeds scraps of wilted cabbage leaves to a goat tethered near the wall. The animal chews with calm concentration, completely unaware it may become part of someone else's stew before winter ends. Or perhaps it does know. Goats often seem spiritually prepared for disaster. Outside, several villagers gather near the lane discussing which animals might be sold at the next market before fodder grows scarcer. One man mentions slaughtering 2 pigs earlier than planned. Another regrets keeping so many chickens alive into January. Nobody judges. Everyone understands. Winter transforms animals from companions or property into equations. You walk toward a nearby pen where several pigs root weakly through frozen straw. Their thick bodies steam faintly in the cold. One of the boys tosses them peelings from yesterday's supper while watching carefully to ensure nothing edible gets wasted. Even pig food matters now. A curious historical oddity drifts through your thoughts as you watch them. In certain parts of medieval Europe, people held small ceremonies or blessed animals during harsh seasons, hoping to protect livestock from illness or bad luck. Some communities believed particular saints watched over horses or cattle specifically, because if you survive long enough beside animals, eventually you start assigning them heavenly management. The air sharpens suddenly as wind cuts across the open yard. Snow swirls around fence posts in dry twisting patterns. Somewhere beyond the village a dog barks once and then falls silent again. Inside the barn the father kneels beside a thin cow and runs rough fingers along its ribs. Too visible. He says nothing for a while, then quietly tells his wife they may need to slaughter one of the smaller pigs soon. Not because they want meat immediately, because feeding it until spring may cost more than the animal is worth. That sentence settles heavily across the room. You realize medieval winter decisions rarely involve good choices, only less dangerous ones. The wife nods slowly while staring toward the hay stores. No argument, no drama. Just tired understanding built from generations of surviving difficult winters. Historians continue examining how peasants balanced immediate hunger against long-term agricultural survival during harsh seasons. Slaughtering animals too early risked future productivity. Keeping too many alive risked consuming vital grain and fodder needed by humans. Entire households walked this narrow line every winter. You step outside carrying a wooden bucket toward the chicken coop. The hens inside fluff themselves against the cold feathers, puffed wide like irritated old women refusing to discuss politics at supper. Egg production has slowed badly now. Less daylight, less feed, more stress. The few eggs collected feel astonishingly precious. One child asks whether the hens are sad from winter. The grandmother replies that everyone is sad from winter. Fair enough. By afternoon preparations begin for the pig slaughter. The mood changes across the household immediately. Not cheerful exactly, but focused. Serious. Winter slaughtering often occurred during colder months, because low temperatures help preserve meat longer. Salted pork, smoked cuts, rendered fat sausages, and preserved organs could support a family deep into the season if managed carefully. Nothing gets wasted. Not blood, not fat, not bones. You help heat water beside the barn while grey clouds gather overhead once again. The smell of smoke thickens in the air. Nearby villagers drift closer offering assistance or simply observing quietly. Animal slaughter in medieval communities is practical but also communal. Shared labour matters. One old man jokes that the pig lived better than most peasants anyway. Several people laugh. The pig does not appear amused. You will not dwell on the details because the villagers themselves do not. Medieval people understood death differently from many modern audiences. Animals were essential, valued and familiar, but survival remained non-negotiable. Winter did not reward sentimentality for long. By evening, strips of pork already hang near the hearth, while fat renders slowly over the fire. The smell filling the cottage feels overwhelming after weeks of thin stews and dark bread. Rich, salty, heavy enough to make your stomach ache with sudden hunger. Even the children look more awake. The grandmother carefully saves blood for cooking later. Sausages will be made tomorrow, bones reserved for broth, skin preserved, fat stored. A practical observation supported by many surviving household records is that medieval cooks possessed remarkable efficiency with animal products. Entire culinary traditions grew from using every possible edible portion because waste could become deadly during winter scarcity. You sit near the fire while snow begins falling heavily outside once more. Wind rattles the shutters. Somewhere in the darkness, another household may be making similar decisions tonight. Which goat survives? Which cow gets sold? Whether the hens receive grain or scraps tomorrow morning? The children fall asleep early beside the hearth, their bellies slightly fuller tonight than yesterday. Their breathing sounds softer now. The father remains awake longer than everyone else. You notice him staring toward the remaining hay stores in the corner, still counting, still calculating. Because even after one pig becomes food, winter itself remains hungry. And spring still feels very far away. The cold changes once the woodpile shrinks. Until now, winter has felt survivable in a grim, exhausting sort of way. Hunger presses quietly at the edges of daily life, but the hearth still burns most evenings. Soup still simmers. Wet gloves still steam beside the fire. Then one morning you step outside and notice the stack of firewood against the cottage wall looks alarmingly small. Suddenly everything feels different. You walk across the frozen yard while dawn struggles through thick grey clouds. Snow squeaks beneath your boots with that dry, brittle sound only deep cold creates. Your breath hangs in the air like smoke. Nearby, the father stands beside the remaining woodpile with an expression normally reserved for battlefield commanders and people reading modern electricity bills. He taps several logs thoughtfully with his boot. Too green, too damp, too few. The realization settles into your stomach immediately. Food shortages and fuel shortages are partners in misery. Without enough firewood, cooking becomes harder. Heating disappears. Drying clothes becomes difficult. Illness spreads faster through damp, freezing homes. Cold itself becomes another mouth to feed. An established truth about medieval winters is that fuel represented a constant labour burden. Wood had to be cut, hauled, dried, stored, rationed, and protected from theft or weather. In many regions, poorer villagers relied on brushwood, peat, straw dung, or fallen branches because quality timber remained expensive or controlled by local lords. Imagine trying to survive January using damp sticks and optimism. The father hands you an axe and gestures toward the edge of the nearby woodland. Several others are already moving through the trees, gathering whatever they can legally take. Legally matters. Forests often belong partly or entirely to noble estates, monasteries, or communal systems with strict rules about gathering wood. Taking fallen branches might be acceptable. Cutting living timber without permission could bring punishment. Medieval survival frequently involves complicated negotiations with authority while freezing. The wood smells sharp and clean compared to the village. Pine resin, wet bark, frozen earth hidden beneath snow. Every sound carries strangely far in the cold air. Axes strike wood somewhere deeper among the trees with slow, echoing rhythm. You gather fallen branches alongside a woman carrying a woven basket across her back. Her fingers are wrapped in strips of cloth against the cold. She moves quickly, selecting only dry pieces worth carrying. No wasted effort. The village children collect twigs nearby while occasionally stuffing icy hands beneath their arms for warmth. One little boy triumphantly lifts a branch barely larger than a spoon, as if presenting royal treasure. At this point, honestly, he kind of is. A fascinating little detail from medieval Europe comes drifting through your mind while you work. In some places, disputes over firewood rights became so bitter during hard winters that villagers secretly stole fence posts, roof beams, or even abandoned carts for fuel. Entire legal records survive documenting arguments about who technically owned dead branches lying on forest ground. Humans become astonishingly specific about property once temperatures fall low enough. You return by midday carrying an awkward bundle of wood tied with a rope. Your shoulders ache. The woodpile still looks disappointingly small after adding it. That is another cruel aspect of winter fuel. It disappears faster than expected. Inside the cottage, the hearth burns lower than usual now. The grandmother carefully pushes embers together to preserve heat. No roaring flames tonight. Only steady, controlled burning. The room already feels colder. You notice it immediately in the way everyone sits closer together. The windows leak icy draught through gaps in the shutters. Smoke drifts unevenly overhead before escaping through the roof vent. The walls themselves feel damp to the touch. Most medieval homes lacked effective insulation by modern standards. Thick stone structures retained cold beautifully. Wooden cottages blocked wind imperfectly at best. Many people spent winter indoors wrapped in layers beside weak fires, while smoke irritated lungs constantly. And candles are scarce too. Once darkness falls, the cottage becomes a world of shadows lit by tiny flickering flames. Rushlights sputter beside the hearth, giving off a faint greasy smell. The family conserves better candles for emergencies or important tasks. Night arrives early in winter, oppressively early. Without reliable lighting, darkness reshapes entire routines. Work slows, conversations quiet. People sleep longer, partly because there is little else to do. You sit beside the fire listening to wind scrape against the walls, while one of the daughters repairs clothing by weak candlelight. Her needle flashes briefly each time the flame moves. She keeps stopping to warm stiff fingers near the embers. Fuel conservation changes cooking too. The evening meal simmers slowly because maintaining strong heat costs wood. Bread baking gets coordinated carefully between households using communal ovens when possible. People reuse warmth constantly. Once a fire burns hot enough for baking, additional foods follow immediately before the heat fades. Nothing gets wasted. Not heat, not light, not ash. A number of historians point out that medieval ash itself had practical value. Wood ash could help make soap preserve certain foods, improve fields, or assist cleaning. Even the leftovers from burning mattered in households surviving close to the edge. The wind outside grows stronger after sunset. Snow rattles against the shutters in dry waves. Somewhere nearby, a baby begins coughing hard enough to echo through the lane. The grandmother mutters that damp cold climbs into the chest. Not medically precise perhaps, but understandable. Cold weakens bodies gradually, fingers crack, feet stay wet too long. Smoke irritates lungs already stressed by poor nutrition. Winter exhaustion builds invisibly until simple illnesses become dangerous. The father finally announces that tomorrow they must reduce fire use during daylight hours. Nobody protests. Everyone already knew. The younger children receive extra blankets that smell heavily of wool and smoke. The adults pretend not to notice the blankets are too thin. You help stack the newly gathered wood near the hearth. The logs knock together with hollow dry sounds. You count them automatically before realizing you're starting to think like the villagers now. Everything becomes numbers eventually. Loaves remaining. Hay remaining. Candles remaining. Logs remaining. Outside, the village fades almost completely into darkness. Only faint orange glows leak from cracks around shutters and doorways. Smoke drifts low beneath the clouds, carrying the scent of burning peat and wet timber. Somewhere farther down the lane, voices rise briefly in argument, likely over wood, or fuel, or whose turn it is to use the oven. Winter compresses patience along with resources. Later, while everyone sleeps, you remain awake beside the dying embers. The room feels colder now despite the blankets wrapped around you. Each crackle from the hearth sounds strangely precious. You understand something important at last. Hunger is terrifying, but cold feels personal. It creeps beneath doors, steals sleep, hardens fingers, turns ordinary nights into endurance. And as the last flames sink lower into ash, the entire cottage seems to lean inward around that tiny fading glow, guarding it carefully against the endless winter dark outside. You begin to feel winter inside your body now. Not dramatically at first. No sudden collapse into the snow while violins play sadly somewhere in the distance. Medieval suffering is usually less theatrical than that. Instead, your hands ache longer after carrying water. Your legs feel heavy climbing even small hills. You wake tired despite sleeping through endless dark nights. The villagers move the same way, slower, carefully, like everyone is carrying invisible weight. Morning arrives under a sky the colour of old tin. Frost creeps thick across the cottage walls inside and out. When you pull on your boots, the leather feels stiff with cold. Nearby, the oldest daughter rubs her hands together before trying to spin wool beside the fire. Her fingers tremble slightly. You notice small things now. The grandfather pauses halfway through lifting a bucket. Children stop playing sooner outdoors. Voices fade quicker after sunset. Winter hunger is no longer only about food stores. It is becoming physical exhaustion. A well-supported observation from medieval life is that ordinary labour never truly stopped during winter, even when fields rested beneath snow. Animals still needed care. Repairs continued. Water had to be carried, firewood gathered, clothing patched, tools maintained. Survival itself required exhausting daily effort during the coldest months. You follow the father toward the frozen well carrying 2 wooden buckets. Snow crunches sharply beneath your boots while bitter wind pushes through every gap in your cloak. The village smells faintly of smoke and wet wool. A woman nearby coughs into her sleeve again and again. Nobody comments on it. The well rope burns your palms with cold while hauling water upward. Ice forms along the edges of the bucket immediately. By the time you carry it back, your shoulders already ache. Now imagine doing this every single day since childhood, without modern nutrition, without insulated clothing, without central heating. Honestly, it is impressive medieval people managed anything beyond lying dramatically in bed complaining about winter forever. Inside the cottage, breakfast feels thinner again, more broth than substance. The family eats silently while the fire struggles against damp wood. One child keeps nodding off beside the hearth before the meal is even finished. Calories matter here in ways modern bodies rarely experience. When food intake drops over long winters, physical strength fades steadily. People become weaker, colder, slower to recover from illness or injury. Yet work continues because stopping work entirely guarantees even greater disaster later. You help repair a section of fence near the animal pens after sunrise. The wood feels rough and icy beneath your hands. Wind stings your ears until they go numb. Nearby, the father drives posts into frozen ground with visible effort. Every strike takes more energy now. A strange little medieval belief surfaces while you work. In some rural communities, people thought certain winter aches came not merely from cold, but from malicious winds carrying sickness or spiritual corruption. Doors and shutters were sometimes marked or blessed to keep harmful forces out during dark months. To be fair, if freezing air kept invading your house for 5 straight months, you might suspect it was personally targeting you too. The village itself looks worn down, not destroyed, just tired. You notice patched shoes everywhere, bent shoulders, faces growing thinner beneath wool hoods. Even the dogs move with less enthusiasm now, curling close to fires whenever possible instead of roaming the lanes. Near the church, several women beat frozen laundry against stones while speaking quietly. Their hands are bright red from icy water. One pauses often to flex stiff fingers before continuing. Work cannot wait for comfort. An increasing number of historians emphasize how physically punishing ordinary medieval labour remained, even during seasons modern people imagine as dormant or restful. Winter reduced agricultural activity, yes, but survival tasks intensified in other ways. Carrying fuel, Preserving food, repairing buildings, caring for animals, and enduring constant cold drained enormous energy. You understand that deeply now while dragging another load of wood toward the cottage. Your breath burns in your chest. Your back aches. And this is after only a short time here. The villagers have endured months already. By midday, snow begins falling again in fine dry sheets drifting sideways through the wind. You pull your cloak tighter and notice how many garments in the village are patched repeatedly. Elbows repaired with mismatched cloth, boots reinforced with scraps of leather, gloves made from old sleeves. Clothing itself becomes survival equipment. Good wool can mean the difference between functioning fingers and dangerous numbness. Yet proper winter garments cost labour and resources many families barely possess. Wet clothing becomes especially miserable because drying it near weak fires takes forever. Inside the cottage, damp socks hang beside the hearth, releasing a sour, steamed smell into the air. The youngest child complains that his toes hurt. The grandmother massages them gently while muttering prayers under her breath. The fire crackles weakly. Outside, the wind keeps rising. You notice tempers shortening too. Nothing dramatic yet. Just small irritations, sharper voices, longer silences after disagreements. Hunger and exhaustion quietly grind patience away from communities over time. One man near the lane snaps angrily when another accidentally bumps his shoulder carrying firewood. They stare at each other for one tense moment before both simply walk away. Too tired to argue properly, a curious account from medieval records comes drifting into your thoughts later that evening. Some physicians and scholars of the period believed excessive winter sleepiness came partly from imbalances in bodily humours caused by cold, damp weather. Their medical explanations were wildly different from modern science, but honestly, after weeks without sunlight and proper food, everybody probably did feel spiritually unbalanced. Supper arrives late. Again pottage. Again dark bread. But tonight the bowls seem quieter somehow. The family eats slowly while shadows flicker across smoke-stained walls. The grandfather keeps rubbing his knees beside the fire. One daughter nods off briefly while mending clothing. Even chewing appears tiring now. You realise winter strips life down to fundamentals. Warmth, food, rest, light. Everything else becomes secondary. Outside, darkness settles early across the village. No music tonight, no storytelling. Only the soft sound of wind moving through cracks in the walls, and the occasional cough from neighbouring cottages. The father checks the remaining wood stack once more before sleep. Always counting, always calculating. You lie beneath the rough blankets, listening to the household breathing around you. The air smells faintly of ash-damp wool and onion broth. Your own muscles ache from ordinary tasks that once would have seemed effortless. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you begin understanding why winter frightened medieval communities so deeply. Not because it killed quickly, because it wore people down piece by piece until even simple survival felt heavy enough to carry with both hands. The manor notices everything. You understand this fully the morning the reeve arrives at the cottage door carrying a wax tablet beneath his cloak. Snow melts slowly from his boots onto the threshold, while the family stiffens almost instantly around him. Not fear exactly, but caution. The reeve smells faintly of horse-damp parchment and cold air. His cheeks are red from travel across the estate. Behind him, pale winter light stretches across the frozen yard where smoke drifts low from nearby cottages. He nods once toward the father. Collection day. Nobody pretends to misunderstand. You step aside while the reeve enters the cottage, stamping snow from his boots near the hearth. His eyes move quickly across the room. Bread stores, firewood, hanging meat. Nothing escapes notice. That is part of his job. In many medieval manorial systems, peasants owed rents, labour services, grain payments, or various obligations to local lords. The exact arrangements differed widely across regions and centuries, but the principle remained familiar. Even during hard winters, obligations did not simply vanish because people felt cold and miserable. Feudalism rarely paused for emotional reasons. A father unties a small sack of grain from beside the wall. You immediately notice how painful the motion feels. The grain could mean several more meals for the family. Instead, it slides across the table toward the reeve. The sound of kernels shifting inside the sack seems strangely loud. The reeve measures the contents carefully while warming his hands near the fire. Outside, wind rattles weak shutters against the walls. One of the children stares openly at the grain being taken away until his mother gently turns his attention elsewhere. A little historical curiosity slips into your thoughts during the tense silence. Medieval reeves were sometimes elected from among local villagers themselves rather than imported officials, which means your neighbour might suddenly become the man responsible for collecting dues during a famine. Imagine trying to maintain friendships after confiscating somebody's oats in February. The reeve records figures onto his wax tablet using a metal stylus. Scratch. Pause. Scratch again. Administration survives winter too. You realise medieval estates depended heavily on counting. Counting grain stores. Counting livestock. Counting labour days owed. Survival for the manor itself required organisation, especially during lean seasons, when shortages threatened everyone from peasants to lords. The grandmother quietly asks whether the lord plans to reduce rents this year due to poor harvests. The reeve hesitates. Not a promising sign. He eventually mutters that discussions continue at the manor house. Discussions? Such a dangerous word when hunger already lives in the village. Some surviving records suggest certain landlords lowered demands or delayed collections during severe hardship, partly from practicality. Dead peasants pay terrible taxes and produce disappointing harvests, yet other estates enforced obligations harshly, despite widespread suffering. Conditions varied enormously depending on local politics, personalities, weather, and economics. The villagers never know exactly which version of authority they will receive. After the reeve leaves, the cottage feels smaller somehow. Quieter. The grain sack sitting near the hearth has visibly shrunk now. Everyone notices it. Nobody mentions it. Instead, the father prepares for his labour duties at the manor despite aching joints and bitter cold outside. Winter may reduce field work, but maintenance continues constantly. Repairs, ditch clearing, cart work, fence building, hauling timber. Medieval estates consume labour endlessly. You accompany him toward the manor grounds later that morning. Snow crunches beneath your boots while grey clouds drift low overhead. The manor itself rises beyond the village, larger than surrounding cottages, but still practical rather than luxurious. Smoke curls from multiple chimneys. Stables line one side of the yard. Granaries stand elevated against dampness and rats. Granaries, always those guarded buildings full of possibility. Several peasants work repairing a damaged fence near the outer field. Their tools clink dully in the cold air. One man coughs repeatedly into his sleeve, while continuing to hammer posts into frozen ground. Nobody stops working. You notice the manor servants carrying baskets between kitchens and storage buildings. Better fed perhaps than many villagers, though hardly comfortable by modern standards. Class differences exist everywhere here, but winter humbles nearly everyone except the truly wealthy. A compelling little detail from estate records in some regions reveals that lords occasionally hosted winter feasts partly to reinforce social bonds and authority during difficult months. Public generosity mattered politically. Feeding tenants visibly could strengthen loyalty and reputation. Of course, whether the food actually reached those needing it most remains another question entirely. The steward supervising repairs walks past wearing heavy wool trimmed with fur. Not extravagant compared to kings or nobles in paintings, but dramatically warmer than peasant clothing. You immediately understand how class could be measured partly by insulation. Warmth itself becomes status. The father works steadily beside the others, despite exhaustion lingering in every movement. His hands look raw from cold beneath worn gloves. Nearby, a younger labourer quietly complains that his household ran out of good flour 3 weeks ago. Another replies they lost 2 chickens to illness yesterday. Conversation during winter always circles back towards survival. researchers continue debating how much tension truly existed between peasants and local authorities during ordinary hard winters versus catastrophic famines. Open revolt remained risky and uncommon in many places, but resentment simmered constantly beneath systems that demanded dues from already struggling households. You do not need historical debate to sense that resentment here. You can feel it in silences, in careful tones, in the way villagers glance toward manor granaries while carrying empty sacks home. By late afternoon, snow begins falling again in thick, wet flakes. Work slows, but does not stop. The steward insists repairs finish before nightfall, because damaged fences risk wandering livestock later. Practicality always wins. Your fingers ache badly by the time everyone trudges back toward the village through deepening snow. Smoke already rises from cottage roofs into the darkening sky. The smell of burning peat hangs low across the lanes. Inside the cottage, supper waits. Thin broth tonight, less bread than yesterday. The family eats quietly while listening to wind scrape against the walls. The father finally mentions how much grain the reeve collected earlier. Nobody responds immediately. Then the grandmother says softly that winter always feels longest after collection days. You suspect she's said that many times before. The youngest child asks why the Lord needs so much grain if everyone is hungry. An uncomfortable silence follows. At last the mother answers carefully. Because the manor must survive too. It is not really an answer, but perhaps no better answer exists inside this system. Outside, darkness settles heavily across the village once more. Somewhere uphill beyond the cottages, manor windows glow faintly through falling snow, while peasants below count loaves firewood and days remaining until spring. And somewhere behind locked granary doors, grain waits in silence while the winter continues measuring everyone against it. You start recognizing the sound of begging before you see it, not loud pleading. Medieval villagers are usually too tired for theatrical desperation. Instead, it comes as hesitant footsteps outside a cottage door. A pause. Then a careful knock barely louder than the wind. You hear it one evening just after sunset. The family around the hearth falls silent instantly. Another knock. The mother sets down her spoon and moves toward the door while the children stare into their bowls, pretending not to listen. Cold air spills inside as she opens it slightly. An old woman stands outside wrapped in layers of worn wool stiff with frost. Snow clings to her shoulders. Her face looks grey from exhaustion. Beside her waits a boy, perhaps 8 years old, clutching an empty sack against his chest. The woman asks softly whether any broth remains. Nobody in the cottage speaks for a moment. That pause feels enormous. You realise charity becomes painfully complicated once everyone is hungry themselves. The mother eventually nods and gestures them inside near the fire. The old woman exhales with visible relief, while the boy keeps staring at the pot hanging above the hearth, as though afraid it might disappear. A widely acknowledged feature of medieval village life is that mutual aid often mattered enormously during difficult winters. Families shared food labour tools or shelter whenever possible, because isolated households struggled to survive alone. Yet charity always existed alongside scarcity. Giving away food could endanger your own family later. Compassion had arithmetic attached to it. The grandmother ladles thin broth into 2 wooden bowls, mostly liquid. A few floating cabbage leaves. Still, the smell alone changes the visitors' faces immediately. Warmth first, then gratitude. The boy drinks too quickly and coughs while swallowing. His hands shake around the bowl. You notice the father quietly tearing off part of his own bread ration and setting it beside the child without saying a word. Nobody acknowledges the gesture openly. Outside, wind pushes snow against the shutters in soft, dry waves. The cottage smells of smoke, damp wool and onion broth. Firelight flickers across tired faces gathered close together. The old woman explains that her daughter fell ill 2 villages away. Roads became difficult. Food stores vanished sooner than expected. They had been walking since morning. You glance at the boy's boots. Too thin. His toes must feel like stones. A fascinating but melancholy detail from medieval Europe drifts into your thoughts while you watch them eat. Certain monasteries and churches maintained alms systems specifically to distribute food or assistance during hard times. Bread pottage ale or shelter might be offered to the poor widows' travellers or the sick. Though naturally the quality and consistency of such charity varied enormously depending on resources and local conditions, the church bell rings faintly somewhere beyond the storm outside. Everyone listens automatically. Faith threads through acts of charity constantly here. Feeding the hungry is not merely kindness, it is moral duty, spiritual obligation. Fear of divine judgment probably helps too, which honestly still counts as motivation. The old woman murmurs blessings repeatedly between spoonfuls. The grandmother waves them away impatiently. Eat before it cools. That may be the gentlest sentence spoken all week. The next morning you walk toward the churchyard where several villagers have gathered beside a small table near the entrance. Snow crunches beneath boots while pale winter sunlight struggles through cloud cover. A monk from a nearby priory distributes coarse bread in careful portions. Not enough for comfort, enough to matter. You notice how orderly the line remains despite obvious hunger. Medieval communities depended heavily on reputation and relationships. Causing trouble publicly could damage future help, future work, future trust. Also, everyone here knows exactly where everyone else lives. The monk's sleeves smell faintly of candle wax and cold stone. His cheeks are red from the weather while he speaks quietly with each person receiving food. One widow bows her head so deeply after accepting bread that you briefly fear she might collapse. An increasing number of scholars emphasize that medieval charity often functioned through networks of obligation and reciprocity rather than simple generosity alone. Communities remembered who helped during hard winters and who refused. Reputation carried real survival value. You see that clearly when one farmer discreetly slips extra onions toward a neighbouring household whose father injured his leg weeks earlier. Nobody comments, but several people notice. Near the church wall, two orphaned brothers huddle beneath patched cloaks, sharing a single heel of bread between them. One keeps glancing nervously toward the food table even after eating, as if hunger itself taught him not to trust temporary relief. You kneel beside them briefly and smell wet wool smoke and stale straw clinging to their clothing. One boy mentions sleeping near a baker's oven last night because it stayed warm longer after dark. Honestly clever. Miserable, but clever. Inside the church, candles burn dimly against cold stone walls while villagers pray quietly. The air smells of incense layered over a damp clothing and melting snow. A priest speaks about mercy, endurance, and St. Martin sharing his cloak with a beggar. The congregation listens carefully. Stories about generosity feel different during winter, more dangerous somehow, because everyone leaves church carrying the same question: how much can we afford to give away? Outside again you notice tensions hiding beneath kindness too. One woman complains quietly that certain families receive help too often. Another insists travellers bring disease. A man mutters that able-bodied beggars should work instead of asking for bread. Some arguments truly survive every century unchanged. Historians continue discussing how medieval communities distinguish between the deserving and undeserving poor. Widows, orphans, the elderly and the sick often received greater sympathy than wandering strangers or able workers without land. Charity existed, but judgment travelled alongside it. By afternoon, snow begins falling once more. Always snow. The village lanes narrow beneath dirty frozen slush while smoke drifts low across rooftops. You help carry a basket of bread scraps toward a neighbouring cottage, where illness has kept the family indoors for days. The scraps smell sour and stale. Still valuable, the sick woman inside thanks you repeatedly while wrapped beneath blankets near a weak fire. Her children stare openly at the bread before she even touches it. You leave quickly afterward because the cottage air feels heavy with fever and dampness. Back at your own hearth that evening, the family supper looks especially modest. Thin broth again. Tiny portions of bread, one onion divided 6 ways. Yet somehow nobody complains when the grandmother sets aside a small bowl near the door in case someone knocks tonight. That decision tells you more about medieval survival than any Lord's account book ever could. because winter may turn villages inward. It may shrink meals, patience, and warmth, but sometimes, beside a weak fire in the middle of a freezing night, people still divide their last onions into smaller pieces, just to make room for one more hungry person at the table. The market feels thinner than it should. You notice it before you even pass through the outer stalls. Fewer voices, fewer animals, less shouting. Medieval markets are usually noisy places filled with smells crashing into each other all at once. Smoke, fish, leather, wet wool, ale, livestock. Human bodies pack too closely together in cold weather. Today the noise feels restrained. Careful. You arrive just after sunrise with the father and oldest daughter walking beside a small handcart carrying eggs, scraps of smoked pork and 2 rough wool cloths the family hopes to trade. Frost still glitters across the road leading toward the market town. Your breath hangs pale in the morning air while distant church bells drift faintly through the cold. The road itself tells part of the story. Too few carts moving, not enough merchants. One wagon passes carrying barrels covered in canvas, and you notice nearly every traveller staring at it with open curiosity. Grain perhaps, saltfish maybe. Anything useful becomes important enough to watch. The father keeps glancing toward the sky. Snow threatens again. Markets matter enormously during medieval winters, because local shortages often force communities to seek supplies elsewhere. Villages that grow enough grain one year may struggle terribly the next. Trade routes become lifelines carrying food, saltcloth tools and rumours between settlements. But winter complicates everything. Bad roads slow carts, frozen rivers block transport, storms delay merchants, prices rise. Always prices. You finally reach the market square shortly before midday. The scene unfolds beneath grey clouds and drifting chimney smoke. Wooden stalls line the muddy edges of the square, while people shuffle through slush and pack snow wrapped in layers of dark wool. The smell hits first. Salted fish, horse sweat, wood smoke, cabbage cooking somewhere nearby, and beneath it all a sharp metallic scent of cold air itself. You pass a baker's stall where dark loaves sit stacked in uneven rows, smaller than expected. More expensive too, judging by the muttered complaints around you. One woman argues loudly with the baker over flour quality. Another customer interrupts to accuse him of mixing too much bran into the dough. The baker snaps back that grain costs nearly double what it did before winter. Everyone sounds exhausted. A recognised pattern throughout medieval history is that food prices could rise rapidly during poor harvest years or harsh winters, especially for grain. Since bread formed the dietary foundation for many ordinary people, even modest increases cause serious hardship across entire communities. You watch a farmer count coins 3 separate times before purchasing a tiny sack of oats. His expression afterward resembles grief more than shopping. The daughter beside you quietly asks whether they should sell the eggs now or wait until later in the day. The father hesitates too long before answering. That hesitation reveals everything. Even trade feels risky now. A curious little market custom from parts of medieval Europe drifts into your thoughts while wandering between stalls. Some merchants publicly swore oaths about weights and measures near churches or civic buildings, because accusations of cheating were so common during shortages. Apparently humanity discovered suspiciously tiny loaf economics extremely early. Near the centre of the square, a fish seller displays barrels of herring packed in salt. The smell could probably wake the dead. Still customers crowd around eagerly, because preserved fish survives winter far better than fresh meat. You overhear one man muttering that prices were lower before the river crossings froze farther north. Another claims merchants are hiding grain deliberately to force costs higher. Rumours spread through hungry crowds faster than fire through dry straw. A growing number of researchers examine how medieval people understood market manipulation and scarcity during difficult years. Even without modern economics, ordinary buyers recognized patterns of hoarding speculation and unequal access to food. Suspicion toward merchants often intensified sharply during winter shortages. You continue through the market while snowflakes begin drifting lazily from the clouds overhead. A travelling peddler sells tiny bundles of herbs beside cheap candles made from animal fat. Nearby, a woman trades knitted gloves for onions rather than coin. Barter still thrives here because cash remains scarce for many villagers. One child stares longingly at roasted chestnuts cooking over a small brazier. The smell fills the air with warm sweetness, almost painful after weeks of thin stew. His mother pulls him gently onward. Not today. The father finally trades the eggs for a sack of coarse barley and a small wedge of hard cheese. You notice how carefully the merchant weighs every item. Every ounce matters now. No generosity, no waste, just calculation. The market square grows louder briefly when a wagon finally arrives carrying grain sacks beneath heavy cloth coverings. People shift toward it immediately like birds changing direction mid-flight. Hope has movement. 2 guards accompany the wagon, which tells you plenty already. The grain seller announces prices that trigger immediate angry murmuring through the crowd. Several buyers walk away at once. Others remain frozen in place, trying to decide whether refusal today means hunger later. The father grips the cart handle tighter beside you. Too expensive. You can see the decision happening silently behind his eyes. A medieval anecdote from some urban records mentions bakers accused of secretly reducing loaf sizes, while maintaining the same prices during shortages. Honestly, modern grocery stores would recognize the strategy instantly. Snow begins falling harder by afternoon, wet flakes turning roads into freezing sludge beneath hundreds of boots. Market energy shifts subtly now. Less browsing, more urgency. People finish purchases quickly before weather worsens. You stop briefly near a tavern where steam fogs the windows and the smell of ale leaks warmly into the street. Inside, several merchants argue over road conditions farther south. Bandits, broken bridges, villagers already running low on grain. News itself becomes a commodity during winter. Back outside, the daughter quietly counts remaining coins beneath her cloak. Not many left. The barley sack beside the cart already looks too small considering how much it cost. That's another cruelty of winter markets. You pay more, receive less, and still feel grateful to have anything at all. As evening approaches, the father decides it is time to leave before snowfall deepens. The road home stretches pale and uncertain through gathering twilight. Around you, other villagers hurry away carrying tiny victories against hunger. A sack of oats, a salted fish, 3 onions, 1 loaf. The market empties gradually beneath drifting snow while crows circle overhead, searching for scraps left behind in the mud. You glance back one last time before leaving. The baker still argues with customers. The grain wagon remains surrounded, and somewhere in the crowd another family is probably counting coins with cold, trembling fingers, trying to decide whether tonight's supper matters more than tomorrow's survival. The roads disappear first, not completely at once. Medieval roads rarely possess the dignity required for dramatic disappearance. They simply become worse day by day, until travel itself feels like an argument against nature. You discover this while leaving the village before dawn beside 2 men carrying sacks toward a neighbouring settlement several miles away. Snow fell heavily overnight, covering ruts and frozen mud beneath a pale, unbroken blanket. The world looks strangely peaceful. Then your boot sinks knee-deep beside the path almost immediately. There it is, the real medieval transportation experience. Cold wind pushes across the open fields while weak sunlight struggles through low clouds. Frost clings to hedges in silver lines. Somewhere far away, a raven calls once before silence swallows the sound again. The road ahead barely deserves the name now. More suggestion than structure. One of the men mutters that carts stopped using this route days ago after an axle snapped in frozen mud near the river crossing. The other replies that travellers farther east are turning back entirely because snowdrifts blocked the forest road. You continue carefully, boots crunching through crusted snow while carrying a bundle of smoked meat intended for trade. Every few minutes someone nearly slips. Travel during medieval winters was often slow, dangerous, and deeply uncertain. Roads became muddy traps during thaws and icy hazards during freezes. Bridges washed out. Rivers changed conditions unexpectedly. Snow obscured paths entirely in some regions. Communities could become isolated for weeks depending on weather and geography, which means shortages became local problems very quickly. You pass an abandoned cart tilted sideways beside the road. One wheel is sunk deep into frozen sludge beneath the snow. The wood creaks softly in the wind. A torn sack lies nearby, leaking scattered grain already pecked apart by birds. Nobody bothered recovering it. Perhaps they could not. The sight unsettles you more than expected, because it looks recent. A peculiar detail from medieval travellour drifts into your thoughts while trudging onward. Some travellers carried bits of bread, charms, or saint tokens, specifically believed to protect against becoming lost during winter journeys. Honestly, once every field becomes identical, white emptiness supernatural navigation probably sounds fairly reasonable. The men beside you speak less as the morning continues. Cold steals conversation. Breath burns in your chest. Your gloves feel damp inside from melting snow. Somewhere beneath your cloak the smoked meat still smells faintly salty and rich, though the scent fades beneath freezing air. After several hours you reach the river crossing, or rather where the crossing should be. The river itself moves sluggishly beneath thick ice gathering along the edges. Wooden planks across the bridge groan alarmingly under shifting frost. One section has partially collapsed, leaving travellers to edge carefully along the remaining boards. You look down through gaps at black water moving silently below. Absolutely not. One of the men crosses first with cautious sideways steps. The bridge complains loudly beneath him. Snow blows across the surface in pale, twisting streaks. When your turn comes, every board feels uncertain underfoot. This is how entire villages lose contact during winter. Not through epic disasters necessarily, just broken crossings, frozen paths, exhausted animals, weather that slowly makes movement too difficult to risk. Some historians continue debating how isolated rural communities truly became during severe winters compared to more ordinary seasonal hardship. Communication still existed through messengers, merchants, clergy, and travellers, but timing became wildly unpredictable once weather turned hostile. You feel that unpredictability everywhere now. Even the sky looks unreliable. By midday, snow begins falling again in tiny sharp grains, stinging your face like sand. The neighbouring village finally appears through drifting white haze beyond a line of bare trees, smaller than expected. Quieter too. Smoke rises weakly from only a few chimneys. Several cottages appear shuttered completely. A dog watches your arrival without barking. Inside the village square you immediately sense tension beneath the usual politeness. Travellers bring news, but they also bring uncertainty. Extra mouths, potential illness, requests for trade. The local reeve questions the men beside you about road conditions before discussing anything else. Can carts still pass? Has the northern route frozen? Were bandits seen near the woods? Bandits remain a real concern because winter desperation pushes some people toward theft. Hungry travellers carrying grain or salt become tempting targets on isolated roads. Imagine risking your life over 2 sacks of barley, and honestly understanding why someone else might attack for them. You enter a small tavern near the square where warmth hits your face almost painfully after hours outdoors. Smoke ale, wet wool, and cabbage soup fill the crowded room with thick, comforting smells. Everyone inside is talking about roads. Always roads. One merchant complains his wagon remains trapped 3 miles south in frozen mud. Another insists a monastery farther west still has grain stores available, though prices sound terrifying. A traveller near the fire claims wolves followed his group for half a day during last week's storm. Nobody calls him a liar. A number of surviving medieval accounts reveal how heavily communities depended on oral news networks carried through markets, taverns, monasteries, and travellers. Information moved slowly, distorted easily, and mattered enormously. Rumours about grain shipments or blocked roads could shape entire local decisions. You warm your hands near the fire while listening carefully. A nearby woman mentions 2 children dying from fever in a settlement farther north. Another says several villagers have started mixing chestnut flour into bread already. The room grows quieter after that. Eventually the trade finishes. Less profit than hoped. Less food acquired than needed. Still enough to justify the journey barely. Barely seems to define winter now. The return trip begins under darkening skies. Snow has thickened across the road, smoothing over tracks left earlier in the day. Visibility shrinks steadily. The world becomes grey sky blending into white ground, until direction itself feels uncertain. One man nearly misses the turn toward the river crossing entirely. You understand suddenly how people vanish during winters like this. No drama, no heroic music, just cold distance and exhaustion slowly erasing certainty. The broken bridge appears at last through blowing snow. Crossing it in darkness feels even worse. Ice cracks somewhere beneath the river surface with a deep echoing sound that freezes everyone in place for one terrible second. Then silence again. You keep moving. By the time your village finally emerges through the storm after nightfall, every cottage window glowing faintly with firelight looks miraculous. Smoke drifts low across the lanes. The smell of burning peat reaches you before the houses themselves. Home. Warmth. Soup, perhaps. Behind you the roads vanish gradually beneath fresh snow once more, and somewhere beyond those white empty fields other villages wait in darkness, wondering whether merchants, news food or help will ever manage to reach them before winter tightens further around the world. Hunger changes the sound of a household. You notice it one evening while sitting beside the hearth as snow tapped softly against the shutters outside. Months ago the cottage felt fuller somehow. Louder. Bowls scraped with confidence. Children asked for second helpings without hesitation. The adults still laughed more easily then. Now every noise feels measured. Spoons move slower. Conversations pause longer. Even chewing sounds careful. The family gathers around the fire for supper while shadows flicker across smoke-darkened walls. The stew tonight is thinner than before, mostly broth with bits of cabbage floating through it like pale scraps of paper. Still warm though. Warm matters. The mother ladles portions with astonishing precision. You realize she always serves the children first now. The father receives slightly less than he once did. The grandmother pretends not to notice when her own bowl ends up shallowest. Nobody discusses this arrangement openly. They simply adapt around hunger together. One of the clearest realities preserved across medieval household records and later observations is that food shortages altered family dynamics profoundly. Rationing decisions often reflected age labour, need social expectations, affection and survival priorities all at once. Parents regularly reduced their own portions to preserve stronger workers or growing children. Love becomes visible in missing bread. The youngest boy asks whether there will be cheese tomorrow. A silence follows, not hostile, just tired. Finally, the mother says perhaps. The boy nods without complaint because children in hard winters learn quickly which questions hurt adults to answer. Outside, wind pushes smoke sideways across the village lanes. Somewhere nearby, a baby begins crying and continues for a long time before finally stopping. The sound slips through cracks in the walls along with icy drafts. You pull your blanket tighter. The father stares into the fire while turning a crust of bread between rough fingers. His knuckles look swollen from cold labour. Across from him, the oldest daughter quietly darns a sock near the embers, stopping every few minutes to warm stiff hands. Nobody wastes movement anymore. A strange and oddly touching custom from parts of medieval Europe comes to mind while watching them. In some households, people save the best tiny scraps from meals for absent family members travelling, serving in war or working elsewhere. Symbolic, perhaps. Hopeful, certainly. Even during shortages, families sometimes held on to rituals of inclusion. The grandmother breaks her bread in half and slips one piece toward the youngest child when she thinks nobody notices. Everybody notices. Nobody comments. That silence feels sacred somehow. Later in the evening, you help the mother reorganize remaining food stores. The cottage smells of onions, smoke, and damp wool drying near the hearth. She counts beans into separate piles with careful fingers, while whispering calculations under her breath. 3 days if stretched, 5 if mixed with oats. Maybe longer if market prices fall. They will not fall. You both know this already. A number of scholars examining medieval domestic life point out that women often managed household food distribution, directly making countless invisible decisions about storage, preparation, and rationing. These choices could determine whether families endured late winter successfully or collapsed into desperation before spring. The emotional burden must have been enormous. You see it clearly in the mother's face now whenever she opens the pantry. Not fear exactly, responsibility. The grandfather begins telling stories beside the fire after supper. Usually the children interrupt constantly with questions or laughter. Tonight they simply listen while curled beneath blankets, too tired to perform childhood properly. He describes winters from decades earlier when rivers froze thick enough to cross with carts. Wolves appearing near barns. A man surviving 3 weeks on boiled beans and onion broth alone. Possibly exaggerated. Possibly not. Memory stretches strangely around hardship. The oldest daughter quietly asks whether this winter feels worse than those years. The old man considers the fire for a while before answering. Not yet. That word settles heavily across the room. Not yet. Outside snow continues falling in soft, steady silence. You realize hunger also changes time inside households. Meals become landmarks dividing the day. Food discussions shape tomorrow's plans constantly. Every remaining onion already belongs partly to the future. The family sleeps closer together now too, partly for warmth, partly because winter shrinks emotional space along with physical comfort. Blankets overlap. Children lean against parents. Even arguments fade faster because exhaustion leaves little energy for long resentment. Though tensions still appear, the next morning the youngest boy cries after discovering someone ate the last dried apple during the night. Nobody admits it. The mother looks genuinely distressed while trying to calm him. The father denies touching it immediately. The grandmother swears she never saw it. You suspect the oldest daughter took it quietly after skipping portions for days, but you say nothing because she avoids everyone's eyes through breakfast. Hunger creates tiny secrets. Not cruelty necessarily. Just survival instincts rubbing against guilt. A fascinating little detail from medieval moral writings reveals frequent warnings against gluttony, even during periods when ordinary people face scarcity routinely. Clergy still preached moderation, fasting, and restraint. Imagine listening to sermons about overeating while surviving mainly on cabbage water and stubbornness. By afternoon, the cottage grows unusually tense after the father returns from labour without extra wages promised earlier. The mother asks whether the manor steward mentioned additional grain distributions. He says no. Too sharply. She falls silent immediately. The children pretend not to hear. Winter compresses emotions the same way it compresses people around fires. Worry has nowhere to go inside small crowded cottages. Frustration lingers in the air alongside smoke and dampness. Yet kindness survives too. That evening, the oldest daughter quietly repairs the youngest boy's torn glove after he falls asleep. The grandmother hums softly while stirring broth near the fire. The father carries extra wood inside without being asked because the wind has grown brutal again outside. Small acts, constant acts, a practical truth about medieval family survival emerges more clearly each day. Households functioned as deeply cooperative units because individual survival alone was nearly impossible during harsh winters. Labour warmth, food, and emotional endurance all depended on maintaining fragile internal balance. You feel that fragility tonight while watching the family share one final crust before sleep. Nobody receives enough, yet somehow everybody still receives something. Outside darkness settles across the village once more. Snow piles against doors. Smoke drifts low beneath the clouds. Somewhere beyond the frozen fields, spring still exists theoretically. But inside the cottage, winter has already rearranged love itself into smaller portions carefully divided beneath firelight. The feast day arrives anyway. Winter does not pause for celebration, and celebration does not erase winter. You wake before dawn to church bells rolling slowly across the frozen fields. The sound drifts through the grey morning air, soft and heavy, muffled slightly by snow. Inside the cottage, everyone is already awake despite the cold. The grandmother adjusts her wool shawl carefully while the children scrub their faces with icy water beside the hearth. Today matters. Even hungry people need days that feel different. The smell inside the cottage surprises you immediately. Not richer exactly, but fuller somehow. The mother has added precious herbs to the morning broth. A small piece of salted pork simmers in the pot, filling the room with savoury warmth, almost luxurious after weeks of restraint. The children notice too. Their eyes follow the pot constantly. Throughout medieval Europe, feast days and religious festivals structured the calendar deeply, especially during long winters. Christmas, Advent, Epiphany, Saints' Days, and other holy observances offered moments of ritual community and emotional relief during harsh seasons. Even poor households often tried to mark these occasions somehow, however modestly. Hope itself required ceremony. You step outside beside the family while frost crunches beneath your boots. Smoke rises from chimneys in pale, twisting columns against the cloudy sky. The entire village feels altered slightly this morning. Cleaner, perhaps. People wear their better clothing if they possess any. Cloaks brushed free of straw. Shoes repaired carefully. One man has even tied coloured ribbon around his daughter's sleeves, though the fabric looks faded from years of use. Tiny efforts toward dignity matter. The church stands ahead, glowing faintly through drifting snow. Candlelight flickers behind narrow windows while bells continue their slow echoing rhythm. Villagers gather quietly near the entrance, breathing clouds into the cold. You smell beeswax before even stepping inside. Then incense, then damp wool warming slowly around crowded bodies. The interior glows gold against the darkness outside. Candles line the altar despite obvious shortages elsewhere. Their light reflects softly across painted saints watching from the walls. One child stares upward in complete awe. Honestly, after months of grey winter and smoke-dark cottages, the church must have felt almost unreal on feast days. A curious medieval custom comes drifting into your thoughts while the congregation settles into prayer. In some regions, special breads or cakes were baked for particular saints' days, sometimes hidden with beans, coins, or tokens inside. The person finding the object received luck or temporary ceremonial status. Humans truly will turn almost anything into a game if it briefly interrupts winter misery. The priest speaks about endurance, mercy, and divine providence, while snow taps gently against the stone walls outside. His voice echoes warmly through the crowded space. Several villagers close their eyes, during prayer looking more exhausted than spiritual. Fair enough. Faith and fatigue are sharing the same bench today. You notice how many people glance toward the church candles, though, toward warmth, toward brightness, toward anything beautiful enough to challenge the season outside. One broadly recognized aspect of medieval religious life is that fasting rules shaped eating patterns heavily throughout the year. Restrictions on meat during certain holy periods meant households relied more on fish, grains, legumes, and preserved foods. Yet feast days also allowed moments of sanctioned abundance whenever resources permitted. Even symbolic abundance mattered psychologically. After the service, villagers linger outside despite the cold, exchanging blessings and scraps of food. One woman hands tiny honey cakes to children from a cloth bundle. Another family shares mulled ale, smelling faintly of spices. Spices. Actual spices. Not many. Probably watered down beyond recognition. Still, the scent alone feels astonishing after months dominated by cabbage and smoke. The youngest boy from your household laughs for the first time in days after tasting the sweetened ale foam accidentally left on a cup. This sound startles everyone slightly, as if joy itself has become unfamiliar. Back at the cottage, preparations continue for the evening meal. The mother unwraps the precious piece of pork saved specifically for this day, while the grandmother produces dried apples hidden for weeks near the rafters, hidden from everyone, including herself perhaps. You suddenly understand that medieval celebrations often depended less on wealth than on restraint beforehand. Tiny luxuries carried enormous emotional power precisely because ordinary life remained so difficult. A number of scholars continue discussing how ordinary peasants experienced religious festivals emotionally during hard winters. Were feast days genuine comfort, temporary escape, social obligation? Probably all at once. Human feelings rarely organize themselves neatly around historical categories. The stew bubbling over the hearth smells richer tonight. Fat glistens faintly across the surface. The children hover nearby pretending to help while clearly hoping proximity speeds supper somehow. Outside, snow falls steadily again. Always snow, yet the cottage feels warmer than usual despite the weak fire. The grandfather begins singing softly while carving the pork into impossibly thin slices. Everyone joins eventually, though nobody remembers all the words correctly. Their voices drift unevenly through the smoky room while candles flicker against the walls. One slice each, carefully measured, still celebrated. You realize feast meals during difficult winters were often modest by modern standards. No endless tables overflowing with roasted meats unless you belong to nobility or wealthy households. Most villages marked holy days through tiny additions. Better bread, perhaps, extra ale, a handful of nuts, one treasured onion added to the stew. Meaning matters more than quantity. The grandmother tells a story after supper about a winter from her childhood when the river froze solid before Christmas, and travellers arrived starving from the north. The villagers shared feast bread with them anyway. Everyone survived until spring, she says firmly. Possibly true, possibly the story improved with age. Nobody challenges it. A fascinating detail from medieval seasonal traditions emerges while listening. In some communities, people believed the behaviour of weather during feast days predicted coming harvests. Snow on certain saints' days could mean fertile fields later. Storms might signal hardship ahead. Winter itself became something people constantly interpreted for signs and warnings. Outside wind shakes the shutters hard enough to rattle the room. Inside the family moves closer around the fire. One child falls asleep with crumbs still clinging to his sleeve. The father finally relaxes slightly for the first time in weeks, leaning back against the wall while holding warm ale between rough hands. Firelight softens the tired lines across his face. For one evening at least, hunger loosens its grip slightly, not because the pantry suddenly fills, not because winter ends, but because people insist on creating meaning anyway. Candles burn lower, songs fade softer, snow keeps falling beyond the walls, and somewhere beneath the cold weight of the season, the village remembers that survival is not only about keeping bodies alive until spring. Sometimes it is also about protecting small moments of celebration from disappearing into the dark. The coughing becomes impossible to ignore. At first, it belonged to strangers beyond the walls. Someone down the lane, someone in church, a traveller resting near the tavern fire. Winter villages always carried sound strangely through cold air, so distant illness felt almost ordinary. Now the coughing lives inside the cottage too. You wake sometime before dawn to hear the youngest boy struggling for breath beneath his blankets. Not choking exactly, just harsh wet coughing that rattles through the dark room again and again while the grandmother kneels beside him, rubbing his back gently. The air smells wrong. Too damp, too warm from crowded bodies and weak firelight, too heavy with sickness. The mother lifts a cup of heated broth toward the child's lips, while outside snow drifts silently against the shutters. The boy's cheeks glow pink with fever. Sweat darkens the edges of his hair despite the freezing weather. Nobody panics. That unsettles you most. Winter illness is familiar here. A firmly grounded reality of medieval life is that cold seasons often brought waves of respiratory sickness, infections, digestive disease, and general physical decline. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, while crowded, smoky homes created ideal conditions for illness to spread. Even minor injuries or ordinary fevers could become dangerous once bodies grew exhausted. The grandmother mutters that his chest sounds tight. The father says perhaps the church healer should visit later. Then everyone continues moving through the morning because survival tasks do not pause for illness. You help carry water while pale daylight slowly spreads across the village. Smoke hangs low beneath the clouds. The lane smells of damp straw and wood ash. Several cottages remain unusually quiet today. Doors closed, shutters sealed. People notice these things immediately. Near the well, 2 women whisper about an old man farther uphill who died during the night after fever took him suddenly. One crosses herself before lowering the bucket into the icy water. Nobody sounds shocked. Winter teaches communities to expect loss. A strange little medical belief from medieval Europe surfaces in your thoughts while walking back through the snow. Some physicians and folk healers believed certain illnesses spread through bad air or corrupted vapours trapped in damp places. Considering the smell inside many crowded winter cottages, honestly, the theory probably felt convincing. Inside the cottage again, the boy sleeps fitfully beside the fire while steam rises from heated cloths laid across his chest. The grandmother adds garlic and herbs to the simmering broth, filling the room with sharp, earthy smells. Garlic appears constantly in medieval remedies. Not magical exactly, just useful enough to earn trust. The father finally leaves to fetch the healer despite worsening weather outside. Snow falls in slow, thick flakes, now muffling the entire village beneath soft white silence. The mother sits beside the boy continuously while mending clothing in her lap. Every few moments she touches his forehead with worried fingers. You notice she no longer eats much during meals either. Stress consumes appetite too. A number of historians examining medieval health emphasize that ordinary people often possessed practical knowledge about care even without modern medicine. They understood warmth, rest broth herbs, hydration, and isolation mattered. Their explanations for disease differed from modern science, but their observations about survival were not always foolish. The healer arrives shortly before dusk, wrapped in layers of dark wool, smelling strongly of smoke and dried plants. She carries a leather satchel filled with bundles of herbs, cloth strips, and tiny jars. Her hands look ancient, steady though. She kneels beside the boy, listening carefully to his breathing while the cottage falls silent around her. Finally, she asks whether he has eaten well recently. Nobody answers immediately. That silence explains enough. The healer mixes herbs into steaming water and instructs the family to keep the child warm. She also recommends onion syrup sweetened with precious honey if possible. Honey again, always valuable. You realize illness changes food priorities instantly. The household begins saving better portions for the sick child without discussion. Softer bread, more broth, tiny scraps of meat from hidden stores. Nutrition becomes medicine. Outside, darkness settles heavily across the village. Wind pushes snow against the walls while church bells ring softly in the distance. Another death perhaps, or evening prayer. Sometimes difficult to separate those sounds during winter. A fascinating but grim little detail from medieval records drifts through your thoughts while helping tend the fire. Certain communities believed illness could travel through emotional states like fear or grief, not merely physical contact. During hard winters, maintaining hope itself became part of survival in people's minds. Honestly, after weeks of hunger and cold despair probably did weaken bodies further. The grandfather begins coughing by the next morning too. Drier than the boys. Still worrying. You notice how quickly illness rearranges the household. Tasks shift automatically. The oldest daughter gathers water alone now. The father handles cooking awkwardly, while the mother remains near the hearth. Sleep grows fragmented because someone always wakes coughing. The cottage smells increasingly medicinal. Herbs, sweat, hot broth, wet wool steaming near the fire. Outside village life slows visibly. Fewer people gather near the well. Conversations happen from greater distances. One woman refuses entry to travellers despite visible exhaustion on their faces. Fear spreads alongside sickness. An accepted understanding among scholars studying medieval epidemics is that communities often developed informal quarantine behaviours long before scientific germ theory existed. People recognize patterns even if they explain them differently. Avoiding the visibly sick became common sense. The church remains crowded, though. Prayer intensifies during illness. Candles burn before saints associated with healing, while villagers whisper names of the sick beneath bowed heads. The smell of incense mingles with cold stone and damp clothing. You kneel beside the grandmother during evening prayer while she murmurs quietly for the boy's fever to break before the next snowfall. Outside, snow continues falling. Inside, the child finally wakes asking weakly for water. Everyone relaxes slightly at once. That single request feels miraculous. The healer returns again 2 days later and nods approvingly after hearing the cough loosen somewhat. She warns the grandfather must rest more, though. He laughs bitterly at that suggestion. Rest! What a luxurious concept. Still, the household mood shifts cautiously upward. The boy manages a few bites of bread softened in broth. The mother finally sleeps properly for several hours near dawn. You understand something deeply unsettling now. Winter illness rarely arrives alone. It enters hungry homes already weakened by cold exhaustion. Poor diet, smoke dampness, and fear. Every hardship layers atop the next until ordinary sickness becomes something far more dangerous. Yet somehow the village continues. Fires still burn, soup still simmers. People still rise before dawn to fetch water through snow. And beside one weak medieval hearth, a child breathes slightly easier tonight while exhausted adults silently count that small improvement as victory enough against the endless winter dark. The charms appear slowly. At first you barely notice them. A small bundle of dried herbs hanging above a doorway. A carved symbol scratched into the cottage beam near the hearth. Tiny crosses sewn into children's sleeves with faded thread. Then one night the grandmother quietly places iron scissors beneath the youngest boy's bed after another coughing fit, and you realize winter has pushed everyone beyond ordinary caution. Now they are protecting themselves from things unseen. The cottage smells strongly of rosemary and smoke this evening. Snowmelt drips steadily from the roof outside while the fire burns low beneath the hanging pot. The boy sleeps more peacefully now, though his breathing still rattles faintly in the darkness. The grandmother moves carefully around the room, whispering prayers under her breath while tying red thread around a bundle of garlic near the doorway. You ask what it does. Keeps bad things out, she replies simply. She does not specify whether those bad things are illness spirits, misfortune, or winter itself. Perhaps all four. Across much of medieval Europe, people blended formal Christian belief with older folk traditions, local remedies, protective rituals, and household superstitions. Villagers prayed to saints, attended mass, carried relics, used herbs, recited charms, and trusted generations of practical wisdom all at once without seeing contradiction. Survival encouraged flexibility. If garlic prayer and boiled onion syrup all might help, then honestly, why not use everything available? Outside church bells echo faintly through the frozen night air. Their sound drifts over snow-covered rooftops, while smoke hangs low across the village like mist. Somewhere nearby, another child is crying again. The grandmother presses a small cloth bundle into your hand. Dried lavender. Carry it, she insists. You suspect the real purpose is not magical protection but comfort. Still, the scent calms you immediately. Soft, floral, almost shockingly gentle after months dominated by ash and cabbage. A curious belief from medieval winter folklore wanders through your thoughts while sitting beside the fire. In certain regions, people thought crossroads became dangerous during harsh weather because restless spirits travelled there after dark. Travellers avoided specific paths at night not only because of wolves or bandits, but because the landscape itself felt spiritually uncertain in winter. Honestly, after trudging through freezing forests with half a loaf of rye bread, you might start believing the woods hated you personally too. The healer visits again the following morning carrying fresh herbs wrapped in cloth. Snow clings to the hem of her cloak while cold air follows her inside. This time she brings willowbark honey and something bitter smelling enough to frighten the children instantly. The grandmother approves. The father looks skeptical. The healer ignores him completely. A practical observation supported by many surviving medical texts and folk traditions is that medieval healers relied heavily on herbal knowledge passed through communities over generations. Some remedies were ineffective, others accidentally worked surprisingly well. Willow bark, for example, contains compounds related to modern pain relief, though unfortunately nobody has invented cough syrup flavoured like berries yet. The healer places heated stones near the boy's feet while muttering prayers to Saint Blaise, often associated with throat illnesses. Then she burns herbs over the fire, sending sharp, fragrant smoke through the cottage. The children stare wide-eyed. The grandfather sneezes violently. The healer claims that means the treatment is functioning properly. Convenient logic. Later that afternoon you walk toward the church where villagers gather despite worsening cold. Candles flicker beneath painted saints, while incense curls upward into shadowed rafters. The priest displays a small silver reliquary said to contain fragments from a holy martyr's bones. People kneel immediately. One woman begins quietly weeping. Faith becomes intensely physical during hard winters. Touching relics, lighting candles, kissing crosses. Hunger and fear make spiritual comfort feel tangible, necessary, almost urgent. Several villagers leave tiny offerings near the altar afterward. Wax, bread, coins. Even during shortages, people still give what they can. An increasing number of scholars emphasize that medieval religion cannot be separated neatly from emotional survival. Rituals created structure, meaning reassurance and communal identity during periods of uncertainty. Prayer did not merely explain suffering, it helped people endure it together. Outside the church, snow falls in slow, heavy flakes while several women discuss remedies for fever. Hot onions beneath blankets, juniper smoke, goat milk mixed with herbs. One insists a copper coin carried inside the shoe prevents winter illness entirely. You strongly suspect the coin mainly causes uncomfortable walking. Still nobody laughs at her. That matters, because certainty itself becomes valuable during fearful seasons. Back in the cottage that evening, the grandmother hangs evergreen branches above the hearth despite their scarcity. Their sharp scent freshens the smoky air instantly. She claims green branches remind the house that winter does not last forever. This statement feels half spiritual and half practical. You notice how often medieval beliefs connect directly to emotional needs. Protection rituals reduce fear. Blessings restore hope. Saints create companionship against isolation. In dark, freezing villages where death and hunger remain close, certainty matters almost as much as food. The father returns late carrying news that another household lost their oldest cow overnight. Illness, perhaps, or cold. Immediately the grandmother crosses herself and tosses salt into the fire. The flames crackle sharply. Nobody questions the action. A lesser-known winter custom from some medieval communities involved making loud noises during certain nights to drive away harmful spirits believed responsible for sickness or crop failure. Bells, shouting, banging tools together. Humans apparently invented yelling at winter centuries before modern internet comment sections. The boy finally laughs weakly before sleep after hearing the grandfather imitate angry spirits fleeing from church bells. The sound fills the cottage with sudden warmth greater than the fire itself. For a few moments everyone smiles, real smiles. Outside, wind pushes snow across the village lanes, beneath a moon barely visible through clouds. Somewhere in the darkness, candles still flicker before saints, while villagers whisper prayers into cold stone churches. Inside the cottage, herbs dry above the hearth. Charms hang quietly from beams. Garlic sways beside the doorway. Perhaps none of it changes the weather. Perhaps none of it stops hunger entirely. But winter is easier to face when people believe something stands beside them against the dark, even if that something smells strongly of rosemary and smoke. The theft begins with turnips. Not gold, not jewels, not secret political documents hidden beneath candlelight by suspicious monks. Just turnips. You hear about it at the well-won grey morning, while villagers gather with stiff hands around the frozen rope. Snowmelt drips steadily from nearby roofs, because the weather has shifted slightly warmer, turning pathways into thick, freezing mud again. A woman whispers that somebody stole vegetables from her storage pit overnight. Another immediately asks how many. 3 turnips and onions. Everyone falls silent. 3 turnips matter now. The woman keeps speaking in a strained voice while pulling her cloak tighter around thin shoulders. She says the pit was covered carefully beneath straw near the back fence. Whoever took the vegetables knew exactly where to look. That detail frightens people more than the theft itself. Hunger has begun studying the village. You walk back through the lanes, noticing how many households now double-check latches, storage chests and hanging food before nightfall. Smoke drifts low across the muddy snow. The air smells of wet straw wood ash and distant pig fat simmering somewhere nearby. Trust is thinning alongside the bread. A significant reality preserved in many medieval court records is that petty theft often increased during hard winters and periods of food scarcity. Stolen firewood, grain, livestock, vegetables, bread, or tools appear frequently in surviving documents. Desperation pushed ordinary people toward risks they might avoid during better seasons, especially when children were hungry. Inside the cottage, the father quietly moves remaining onions to a different hiding place beneath loose floorboards, while the grandmother watches without comment. You notice nobody asks whether the thief deserved punishment. The first question is always who might be starving badly enough to do it. That tells you something important. The oldest daughter admits several families farther down the lane have nearly exhausted their grain already. Another household reportedly slaughtered their last goat weeks earlier. Winter is entering its sharper phase now, the phase where morality starts negotiating with survival. A peculiar legal detail from medieval Europe drifts into your thoughts, while helping patch a fence later that afternoon. In some places, stealing food out of obvious hunger occasionally received lighter punishment than other forms of theft, especially for children or first offences. Not always. Some authorities remain brutally strict, but even medieval courts recognise the uncomfortable difference between greed and starvation. You pass a small field near the manor where several villagers crouch low, searching frozen ground for overlooked vegetables left after autumn harvest. Gleaning again? Always gleaning. One old man uncovers half-rotten cabbage leaves and smiles with genuine relief. That image stays with you longer than expected. The manor steward rides through the village before dusk accompanied by 2 guards. Hooves splash through muddy slush while villagers step aside automatically. Word spreads quickly that someone attempted to steal grain from a storage shed near the estate barns during the night. Attempted. Caught before escaping. Nobody knows who yet. The guards question several labourers while smoke curls from nearby cottages into darkening skies. You notice how carefully everyone avoids eye contact. Fear changes posture. An increasing number of historians studying medieval crime emphasise that many so-called criminal acts during hard winters likely emerged from economic desperation rather than organised lawlessness. Hunger blurred social boundaries. Respectable villagers could become poachers, smugglers, or thieves under enough pressure. You understand that now while watching the steward inspect footprints near the granary. The tracks already fill slowly with fresh snow. Back inside the cottage, supper feels especially tense tonight. Thin pottage again. Less bread than yesterday. The youngest boy asks innocently whether people steal because they are evil. Nobody answers immediately. Finally, the grandfather sighs softly beside the fire. Sometimes because they are cold. That response settles across the room heavier than any sermon. Outside, wind rattles the shutters hard enough to shake ash loose from the hearthstones. The grandmother quietly checks the hidden onions once everyone else sleeps. Twice. The next morning brings another story. Someone snared rabbits illegally in the Lord's forest. Poaching. Technically criminal. Practically understandable. Forests during winter become contested spaces full of dangerous temptation. Rabbits, deer, birds, fallen wood, even fish trapped beneath river ice all represent possible survival. Yet hunting rights often belonged heavily to nobles or estates. Peasants caught poaching risked severe punishment depending on local law and circumstance. Still hungry, people continue trying. A fascinating little anecdote from medieval folklore emerges while walking through the village later that day. Some communities told stories about spirits punishing greedy thieves during winter by leading them into snowstorms or freezing forests. Morality tales become sharper when survival itself feels fragile. The irony, of course, is that actual winter already punished everyone quite effectively. Near the churchyard you encounter the widow whose vegetables were stolen earlier. She now keeps her remaining food stores hidden inside old grain sacks beneath dirty laundry, because she believes thieves will search obvious places first. She is probably correct. The village itself feels more suspicious now. Conversations stop when strangers approach. Doors close faster after dark. One man accuses another of taking firewood without permission, leading to a brief furious shouting match near the well before exhaustion dissolves the argument. Nobody has energy for proper violence, only bitterness. A respected interpretation among scholars examining famine behaviour is that communities often balanced punishment and mercy uneasily during shortages. Villages needed order to survive collectively, yet harsh enforcement against starving neighbours could also destroy social cohesion. You see both instincts constantly now. Protect the food, protect the people. Sometimes impossible to do both. That evening the father returns carrying unexpected news. The grain thief near the manor was a boy, 14 perhaps, caught trying to fill a sack through cracks in the storage boards. His family reportedly ran out of flour days ago. Silence fills the cottage immediately. The grandmother closes her eyes briefly beside the fire. The youngest child asks what punishment he will receive. The father stares into the flames for a long moment before answering. Depends how hungry the steward feels. Nobody speaks afterward. Outside, snow begins falling again in slow, heavy flakes covering muddy tracks across the village. Somewhere beyond the cottages, a hungry boy sits frightened beneath manor guard, while grain remains locked safely inside thick wooden walls. Inside the cottage, the hidden onions wait beneath the floorboards, counted carefully, protected carefully. Because winter has reached the point where even good people sometimes look at a neighbour's turnips and see the difference between surviving until spring or not surviving at all. The first sign of spring is not warmth, it is mud. You wake one morning expecting the same hard, frozen silence that has wrapped the village for months, only to hear dripping instead. Slow, steady dripping from roof edges, water running beneath packed snow, boots sucking wetly into thawing ground outside. The sound feels almost shocking. Winter has not ended yet. Far from it. The air still bites your face when you step outdoors, and patches of ice cling stubbornly to every shadowed corner. But something underneath the season has shifted. The earth is loosening. You stand beside the cottage while pale sunlight filters weakly through torn grey clouds. Smoke rises straighter today without heavy snow pressing it downward. The village smells different too. Wet soil, rotting straw, damp wood waking after months beneath frost. And mud, so much mud. Every lane has become a brown, slippery battlefield determined to swallow boots whole. Chickens stumble through it indignantly, while children laugh for the first time in weeks after slipping near the well. Nobody even scolds them properly. People are too relieved by the sound of laughter. One of the most important truths about medieval survival is that late winter and early spring often form the hardest stretch of the entire year. Food stores ran dangerously low by then, while new crops had not yet matured. Historians sometimes call this the hungry gap or lean season because households faced exhaustion precisely when remaining supplies grew thinnest. Spring looked beautiful from a distance. Up close it was complicated. Inside the cottage the pantry feels alarmingly sparse now. Only a little rye flour remains, a few onions softening at the edges, dried peas carefully counted into tiny portions. Yet the family moves with slightly more energy today despite the shortages, because the thaw means possibility. The father speaks about field preparation while sharpening tools beside the hearth. The oldest daughter checks stored seed grain repeatedly to ensure dampness has not ruined it. Seed grain, the most dangerous temptation in the house. Everyone is hungry enough to eat it. Everyone knows doing so risks disaster later. You realize medieval survival depended constantly on resisting short-term desperation for long-term hope. Outside villagers begin gathering near the fields, carrying tools across muddy ground. Snow still clings in pale patches between furrows, but dark soil appears beneath it now like bruises across the earth. The smell rises rich and cold. Living. A fascinating little seasonal tradition drifts through your thoughts while watching them work. In some medieval communities, the first ploughing of spring involved blessings, prayers, songs, or ceremonial gestures meant to encourage fertility and good harvests. After surviving winter hunger, the act of turning soil again probably felt deeply emotional. The grandfather kneels briefly near one field, pressing thawed earth between rough fingers. "Still cold," he mutters, but he smiles afterward. That alone tells you enough. An increasing number of scholars examining medieval agricultural rhythms emphasize how psychologically important seasonal transitions became in rural communities. Spring represented labor and uncertainty, certainly, but also renewal. Survival through winter gained meaning once planting resumed. The village changes rapidly over the next days. Doors remain open slightly longer. People linger outdoors despite chilly winds. Children search eagerly for signs of green shoots near walls and ditches. One boy proudly discovers tiny wild onions growing beside a fence and carries them home like treasure. Honestly, they are treasure. Fresh food has become almost mythical after months dominated by salt smoke and dried grain. The grandmother immediately chops the onions into broth that evening. Their sharp green smell fills the cottage instantly bright enough to make everyone pause. Freshness itself tastes medicinal now. A well-established observation from medieval diets is that early spring greens and herbs often played important nutritional roles after long winters. Nettles, wild garlic, sorrel, onions, and other plants provided badly needed vitamins and variety once available again. The body remembers green food. You feel it while eating that night's thin soup, somehow transformed by a handful of fresh leaves. Outside geese fly overhead one morning in ragged, uneven formation. The entire village stops to watch. Nobody speaks until the birds disappear into cloud cover. Then several people cross themselves quietly. The thaw also brings problems immediately. Flooded paths, collapsing fences, rotting stored vegetables discovered too late. The river swells dangerously beneath melting ice, carrying broken branches and grey slush downstream. Roads become nearly impassable again, though differently now. Carts sink into deep mud instead of snowdrifts. Winter refuses to leave gracefully. A curious belief from some medieval farming communities comes to mind while helping repair drainage ditches. Certain people judged the coming harvest by watching animal behavior during early spring thaw. Frogs, birds, sheep, even insects supposedly carried signs about future weather. After months of uncertainty, humans begin searching everywhere for reassurance. The father finally decides to bring out the plough ox despite its visible thinness. The animal moves slowly across the field while cold mud clings heavily to its legs. Every rib still shows beneath rough hide. But it is alive. That matters enormously. You help scatter manure across one small patch of field while icy wind cuts through your cloak. The work feels exhausting after winter weakness, yet strangely hopeful too. Labour now points forward instead of merely enduring. Inside the village, hens begin laying slightly more eggs again as daylight lengthens. One morning, the youngest boy runs into the cottage holding a fresh egg carefully in both hands, like a sacred object. The grandmother laughs aloud, actually laughs. The sound startles everyone. Researchers still discuss how quickly ordinary medieval communities recovered emotionally after severe winters. Some evidence suggests resilience returned surprisingly fast once weather improved. Other accounts describe lingering weakness, debt, and trauma lasting years after bad harvest cycles. You suspect both are true. People recover while still carrying fear. The nights remain cold, though. Very cold sometimes. Frost still appears unexpectedly across the fields, before dawn reminding everyone winter has not surrendered fully yet. The family continues rationing food carefully, because spring planting increases labour, demands long before new harvests arrive. Hope itself burns calories. One evening the father studies the nearly empty flour sack beside the hearth, while rain taps steadily against the roof outside. "We are close now," he says quietly. "Not safe. Just close." Outside, muddy lanes glisten beneath pale moonlight while water drips steadily from every roof edge in the village. Somewhere beneath the thawing field, seeds wait in darkness. And after months spent counting loaves, guarding onions, and surviving one freezing day at a time, the village finally dares to imagine green things growing again beyond the winter. People remember bad winters longer than wars. You understand this while sitting beside the hearth one rainy evening as the grandfather speaks softly into the firelight. Outside, thawed earth squelches beneath dripping roofs. The snow has mostly vanished now except for dirty patches hiding in shadows near the forest edge. Spring is arriving slowly, yet everyone still talks about winter as though it remains in the room. The cottage smells different these days. Fresh mud carried in on boots, damp grass, onion greens drying near the hearth. Still smoke, of course, always smoke, but the air no longer feels sealed shut beneath endless frost. The grandfather turns a wooden cup slowly between rough hands while the rain taps against the roof. "You never forget the lean years," he says quietly. Nobody argues. Around him the family listens with that peculiar stillness people use when hearing stories they already know but still need repeated. Because memory itself becomes survival. Across medieval Europe, communities preserved memories of famine, brutal winters, failed harvests and disease through stories, songs, sermons, chronicles, and local traditions. Catastrophic seasons often shaped behaviour for generations afterward. Families planted differently, stored more carefully, distrusted certain weather patterns forever. Trauma became practical knowledge. The grandfather begins describing a winter from his childhood when snow buried fences completely, and villagers survived partly on bean mash mixed with tree bark. The youngest boy wrinkles his face in horror. The grandfather laughs softly. "You eat what keeps spring possible." That sentence settles gently into the room. A remarkable detail from medieval folk culture drifts through your thoughts while listening. In some regions, people named particularly terrible winters after memorable disasters or strange events. The winter of starving wolves, the Black Frost year, the winter the river killed the bridge. Collective suffering became attached to storytelling, almost like weather developing personality. Outside church bells echo faintly through damp evening air. The sound feels softer now without snow muting the world. The grandmother adds fresh nettles to the stew simmering above the hearth. Their sharp green smell cuts through the smoke instantly. Everyone notices. Fresh plants still feel miraculous. The father mentions hearing that another village lost nearly half its sheep during the worst freeze earlier this season. The oldest daughter replies that merchants at the market already complain about rising grain prices for next year too. Winter may be ending physically. Its consequences continue travelling. A substantial body of historical evidence suggests repeated cycles of scarcity shaped medieval thinking deeply. Communities expected hardship periodically. Good harvests were celebrated partly because everyone remembered how quickly conditions could reverse. Security always felt temporary. You see that caution everywhere now. Nobody wastes crumbs despite improving weather. Nobody trusts the skies completely. The pantry still gets checked each night. You walk outside briefly before supper while twilight spreads pale blue across the village. Mud glistens between cottages. Chickens scratch eagerly through thawed ground, searching for insects. Smoke rises lightly into cool evening air, carrying scents of peat and wet wood. The village sounds more alive. Children shout somewhere near the well. A dog barks repeatedly at absolutely nothing. One woman laughs loudly enough for nearby houses to hear, small sound returning. Near the churchyard, several older villagers stand discussing previous winters, with the serious tone usually reserved for battles or funerals. One insists this year was mild compared to decades earlier. Another swears no winter since his youth matched the great famine years his parents described. Memory competes constantly in communities like this. Whose suffering was worst? Whose survival most impressive? A curious medieval habit appears in your thoughts while listening nearby. Some monasteries and chroniclers recorded extreme weather events carefully alongside political history eclipses and royal deaths. A brutal winter mattered historically because everyone understood weather could reshape entire societies. The rain begins again before you return inside. Soft, steady rainfall now instead of snow. The roof leaks slightly near one corner of the cottage, forcing the family to place a bucket beneath the dripping water. Nobody seems concerned. Compared to winter, a leaking roof feels almost cheerful. Inside, the grandfather continues talking after supper. He describes villagers once hiding grain inside church walls during famine fears, travellers collapsing from hunger near frozen roads, a woman who supposedly kept her family alive by gathering nettles all spring after stores failed completely. Researchers continue examining how accurately oral memory preserved details of medieval disasters across generations. Stories change, certainly, details blurred, yet emotional truths often remained powerful long after exact dates disappeared. You believe that completely now, because the family does not merely remember winter intellectually. Their bodies remember. The father still counts firewood automatically before sleep, even though temperatures rise steadily. The grandmother still saves onion peels for broth. The children still eat quickly whenever fresh bread appears. Hunger leaves habits behind. Later that night, the oldest daughter admits quietly while repairing clothes near the fire that she hid food beneath her mattress earlier in winter. Not much, just crusts, tiny scraps, in case she says softly. Nobody judges her. That may be the saddest part. The mother reaches across the table and squeezes her hand briefly before returning to mending. Outside, frogs begin croaking somewhere near the thawed marshes beyond the fields. The sound feels almost unreal after months dominated by wind and silence. Spring keeps arriving in pieces. The grandfather eventually falls asleep beside the hearth, while rain whispers steadily against the roof. Firelight flickers across his lined face. You wonder how many winters he carries inside those memories. How many shortages. How many cold, frightened nights listening to children cough beneath thin blankets. A growing number of scholars studying medieval resilience argue that memory itself formed part of community survival systems. Stories about past hardship taught caution, preparation, cooperation, and endurance. People survived partly because previous generations remembered what failure looked like. The village will remember this winter too. The stolen turnips. The hungry boy near the granary. The thinning bread. The first green onions after months of grey hunger. Years from now, children not yet born may hear about the season when snow buried the roads and the river nearly froze solid. And somewhere inside those future stories, hidden beneath exaggeration and fading details, will remain the simple truth that carried this village through the dark months. People endured because they remembered others had endured before them. The thaw arrives quietly. No triumphant music. No golden sunrise spilling dramatically across the fields, while villagers dance through flower-covered meadows carrying fresh bread and emotionally stable chickens. Just rain. Soft rain tapping against the roof before dawn. You wake to the sound and lie still beneath rough blankets, listening carefully. The cottage air feels different now, cooler somehow without the heavy smoke trapped by winter cold. Damp earth breathes through cracks in the walls, alongside scents of wet grass and thawed mud. The fire beside the hearth is burned low overnight, but nobody rushed desperately to preserve every ember this time. That alone tells you the season has changed. Outside morning spreads slowly across the village in pale silver light. Water drips steadily from roof edges. Mud covers the lanes in deep brown ribbons where snow once stood waist-high. Tiny shoots of green push through the earth near fences and stone walls. Not many, enough. The villagers move differently too. Still tired, still thin, but no longer braced constantly against freezing air. One of the strongest conclusions drawn from surviving medieval records is that simply reaching spring often represented genuine triumph for ordinary rural households. Winter survival depended on careful rationing, Luck, labour weather, social support and resilience layered together across months of uncertainty. There were no guarantees. You walk toward the fields where the father and several neighbours already work beneath grey clouds. Oxen pull slowly through soft earth while birds wheel overhead, crying sharply in the damp morning air. Birdsong, you realise suddenly how long it has been since the village sounded alive. The soil smells rich and wet beneath your boots. Everywhere people bend, lift, repair, plant. Winter stripped life down to endurance. Spring rebuilds motion. The grandfather pauses beside a furrow, breathing hard after only a few moments of labour. His body still carries the season heavily. Around him, others move carefully too. Hunger leaves traces behind even after food begins improving. Yet nobody complains much. Complaining belongs more naturally to winter. A charming little medieval custom wanders through your thoughts, while helping scatter seed grain across one narrow field. In some places, villagers celebrated the return of spring by decorating ploughs, singing planting songs, or sharing ceremonial meals after the first successful sowing. After months spent fearing empty stores, the act of placing seed into living earth must have felt almost sacred. Back in the village, cottage doors remain open longer now. Smoke rises lazily instead of pressing low beneath frozen skies. Chickens scratch furiously through thawed ground while children chase one another around puddles with astonishing energy, considering how exhausted they looked weeks earlier. The youngest boy from your household proudly carries a bundle of fresh greens nearly larger than himself. Nettles mostly. Still, the grandmother reacts as though he'd discovered buried treasure. Because in a way he has. Inside the cottage, the stew pot changes again. Less salt, less dried grain, more green things. The smell rising from the broth feels brighter somehow. Sharp onion, fresh herbs, young leaves softening in steam above the fire. The mother tastes the soup and smiles faintly before adding another handful of greens. That smile carries months inside it. An intriguing point many historians continue exploring is how quickly emotional recovery followed seasonal hardship in medieval communities. Physical weakness could linger long after winter ended, yet evidence also suggests remarkable resilience. People resumed planting, trading, marrying, celebrating, and rebuilding with surprising speed whenever conditions allowed. Perhaps humans simply cannot survive otherwise. The market road improves slowly over the next days, still muddy enough to swallow careless boots, but passable. Travellers begin appearing more often again, carrying news from other villages. Some survived well, others did not. One settlement farther north reportedly lost nearly half its livestock after fodder failed early. Another enjoyed unexpectedly mild weather and now trades surplus oats at lower prices. Fortune always moved unevenly across medieval landscapes. You sit beside the churchyard one afternoon watching villagers repair damaged fencing, while swallows dart through the cloudy sky overhead. The priest speaks with several women about organising a Thanksgiving service for surviving the winter. Surviving, not thriving. That distinction matters. A curious seasonal belief from parts of medieval Europe drifts through your thoughts while listening nearby. Certain communities thought the first thunder of spring chased lingering evil from the earth after winter. Children sometimes counted seconds between lightning and thunder to judge how close storms travelled. You secretly hope a storm arrives soon. The air feels ready for it. One evening, the family shares a meal outdoors for the first time since autumn. Just rough bread broth and early greens beside the cottage wall, while sunset glows pale gold across muddy fields. Simple. Quiet. Perfect. The grandfather watches smoke rising into the evening sky and murmurs that winter always feels endless while you're inside it. Then suddenly it becomes memory. You understand exactly what he means, because the village already seems to breathe differently now. Doors creak open. Conversations last longer. People laugh more easily. Even the dogs appear less offended by existence. Yet winter remains present too, in thinner faces, in empty stores, in repaired clothing and weakened animals. The season leaves marks behind like water stains on wood. A growing number of researchers studying medieval climate and daily life emphasized that survival itself was often cyclical rather than stable. One good spring did not erase vulnerability. Another hard winter would come, eventually. People knew this intimately. Perhaps that knowledge made ordinary comforts feel sharper. Warm broth, dry socks, a green field after snow. The final rain begins after dark while the household settles near the hearth one last time together. Not because the fire is desperately necessary anymore, but because habit still draws everyone close. The cottage smells of fresh herbs now instead of only smoke. Outside frogs sing from flooded ditches beyond the fields. Rain taps softly against the roof while distant thunder rolls somewhere far away across the warming earth. You sit quietly listening to those sounds, alive sounds, and slowly the village drifts towards sleep, no longer counting how many loaves remain until spring arrives. Because spring is already here at last. The long hunger has not vanished completely. The memories will stay. But tonight, beneath gentle rain and the scent of new green things growing through thawed soil, the people who survived medieval winter finally allow themselves to rest. The fire burns low, the rain keeps falling, and somewhere beyond the dark fields another season begins turning patiently toward the light. Word count 1189. The rain softens further as the night deepens. Inside the cottage the fire settles into a quiet glow, rather than the desperate crackling heat of winter evenings. The family sleeps close together out of habit, now not fear of freezing. You can hear slow breathing around the room, steady and peaceful, beneath the faint patter of rain on the roof. The air smells of damp earth and herbs drying near the hearth. No sharp hunger, no panic, just exhaustion slowly loosening its grip at last. Outside the village rests beneath soft darkness. Muddy lanes shine silver beneath clouds drifting across the moon. Somewhere near the fields, frogs continue singing from shallow pools left by melting snow. A horse shifts quietly in its stall. Water drips from roof edges into puddles below with patient rhythm. Winter feels far away already. Yet you know the people here will carry it with them for years. They will remember the thin bread, the hidden onions beneath the floorboards, the coughing nights beside weak fires, the careful counting of grain by candlelight. And they will also remember smaller things. Warm broth shared with strangers. Children laughing at the first mud of spring. Fresh greens floating in the stew pot after months of grey meals. The sound of rain instead of snow. You settle deeper beneath the blankets while the firelight flickers softly against the walls. The cottage creaks gently around you, like an old wooden ship finally reaching calm water after a long storm. No one needs to speak anymore. The season has already said everything, so you let your eyes grow heavy while the rain continues falling over fields ready for planting once more. The dark no longer feels empty now. Beneath the soil, seeds wait quietly. Birds sleep in the hedges. Smoke rises softly from village chimneys into the cooling spring air. And somewhere in the peaceful distance beyond the muddy roads and thawed rivers and sleeping cottages, dawn is already beginning its slow journey back toward the world. Sweet dreams.